So now I'm going to walk through, at least partly through, we'll see how far we get, I'm going to walk through Pinocchio with you because that's what the movie's about. And it's hard to say how it came about, like it was written, a story by a guy named Collodi, C-O-L-L-O-D-I. It's quite a bit different, the story, the written one, from the Disney version. The Disney version was a product of the collaboration of geniuses of animation, essentially. So they were artistic geniuses, great at capturing motion and emotion and all of that, be stellar at that, and imaginative, tremendously imaginative, but collectively imaginative. And so they put together a collective product. And you might say, well, how did they do that exactly? It's like, well, they were good storytellers. And what does that mean? Well, it means you know the story that works and the story that doesn't. And maybe partly what you do is you kind of think out a story and you think, well, what if this happens? And well, maybe this should happen. Oh, that's the thing. Oh, that would work. It's like the little flash of inspiration, right? It's like you got a piece of the puzzle that fits. You think, yeah, that would work there. And then you talk to the other people and you generate ideas and someone says, well, what if they do this? And everyone goes, no, that's just not believable. No one's going to buy that. And someone else has a little revelation. They say, well, you know, it makes some sense somehow if they do this. And everybody goes, oh yeah, that really works. It's like, why? Why? Well, you don't know. You don't know why it works. But it works because it's the right story. And so what does that mean? Well, it's kind of associated with this metagame idea. You know, it's like there's a story that you should be acting out that works across games, and you have an inkling of it, you have a notion of it, you have a vague apprehension of it. It's sort of built into you. That's archetype. That's an archetype. And so then when you read a story that works, you're just entranced by it. And you all know that. You go to a movie and it's a great movie and it's like you're just blown away. You know, a movie can pull you in and turn you into one of the screen characters and like run you through a huge set of emotions. She brings those who love, that's what that should say, the sweet fulfillment of their secret longing, like a bolt out of the blue. Fate, characterized here as feminine. And that's what happens in the movie. The movie's got a Christian underbelly, like it's quite pronounced, but it's really a pagan movie in many ways. So for example, there's no blue fairy and the reason I'm speaking of Christianity, of course, is because this movie was created in a culture where Christianity was still reasonably intact, and of course it was fully informed by that, but the underlying mythos is not precisely Christian, even though it's informed by Christian imagery. There is this old idea, I think it's a Gnostic idea, that the wisdom of God is feminine, something like that, and anima, which means soul, is feminine. And so there's an idea like that lurking here. And anyways, that's fate, and that's the blue fairy in this particular movie. You know, she comes down from the star, which is kind of makes her an avatar of God. That's the idea. And she's the transformative agent. She's really Mother Nature, you know, in her positive guise, and that's why she can animate. To animate something means to infuse it with soul. That's what it means. And she animates Pinocchio, right? She's the force that frees him from his strings. And so that's her. Fate, like a bolt out of the blue, fate steps in and sees you through. Well, what that means, it means something like this, is that, you know, if you orient yourself properly in the world, and we'll say that you do that by trying to attain the ultimate goal, whatever that happens to be, then it's as if the world is on your side, and things go well for you. And I also believe that's true, because certainly one of the things that's more or less self-evident is that, generally speaking, if you tell the truth, things go a lot better for you. And the reason for that is, well, do you want to have reality opposed to you, or do you want to have reality backing you up? It's like, it's a pretty straightforward question. If you're truthful to the degree that you can be truthful, then reality is on your side. That's a good thing, because there's a lot of it and there isn't much of you. Whereas if you take a deceitful approach to things, then, well, then you're challenging reality. It's like, good luck with that, man. It's like you're holding a plastic ruler in front of your face and bending it, you know, and at some point you're going to let go, and it's going to, all that force that you've stored up, and it's going to snap back and nail you, and that happens. Like, I've just never seen anyone in my clinical practice ever get away with anything. Nothing. And it's not surprising. It's like, if you're going to mess with the structure of reality, like it's going to mess back, and it does. And it might not happen for years, and you might not even notice the connection. I mean, part of what you do in psychotherapy is actually make those connections. It's like, why did this horrible thing happen to me? Well, who knows? It's like, let's take it apart. Well, who knows how far back we have to go? It might even have things to do, not even with you, it might have things to do with the errors in your parents' relationship. Like, you just can't mess with the structure of reality. It stays warped until you straighten it out, and it's not good. So there's an injunction here, which is that, you know, if you follow this path, you pick a high goal and you put your heart in it, you know, you commit to it, believe in it. Believe means to love. Believe and be love is the same thing. It means to act out. And that's what the belief means. Like, we think belief means to accept a set of propositions as true. Well, that is one form of belief, but that's more like factual knowledge, right? Belief is more like you decide that you're going to act something out. You make a decision and then you act it out, and that's a reflection of your belief. You know, it's you're staking yourself on something. Do you know? Well, no, because you can't. You can't know. You're bounded by ignorance. You can make your best guess and move forward. And you can do that with commitment, but you have to believe in order to do that. I guess that's why it's a wish. Okay, so fine. Well, then we have Jiminy Cricket. That's southern US slang for Jesus Christ, by the way. And the initial overlap isn't a fluke. I mean, I'm sure the animators thought that was funny, and of course it is funny. And you know, in The Lion King, you know that baboon who's the shaman, basically? Well, to begin with, he was kind of just a comic relief character, like a fool, you know. But one of the things Jung mentioned about the fool is that the fool tends to turn into the savior. It's an archetypal reality. Bugs Bunny is sort of like that, you know, he's a trickster. And as the movie developed, the character of the fool baboon took on the full-fledged, you know, shaman priest element. And you know, okay, well, Jiminy Cricket, he's this little cricket, and he turns out to be the conscience, which is pretty damn weird. It's like a bug is your conscience, and a bug is JC, and it's like, that's a very strange juxtaposition of ideas. Conscience, insect, savior. It's like, what's up with that? And so, well, what bugs you? That's part of it. Well, your conscience certainly bugs you, and you should pay attention to it. It's just a little niggling, annoying thing that you can't quite, you can override it, right? Obviously. But it's this, well, and he says, when he talks to Pinocchio later, he says it's that still small voice, you know. And I've asked people before, like in my personality class, like, because conscience is a weird thing, and like, if I said to you, if you're about to do something that you know you shouldn't do you have a voice in your head that tells you that you shouldn't do it? So how many people have had that experience? Okay, good. Now, so other people have a feeling instead of a voice, and so is there anybody here who's willing to admit it, who has neither the feeling nor the voice? Okay, so, and you know, it's a very understudied phenomena in psychology, this conscience. I mean, people can be conscientious, and maybe those are people who listen to their conscience more. I don't know, but nobody's ever investigated it. And okay, so, well, that's the conscience, and that's Jiminy Cricket. And then the cricket opens this book, and then you look at the book, and you think, well, what kind of book is that? Well, it's got a spotlight on it, so it's being highlighted. This is an important book. And what kind of book is it? Well, it's leather bound. It has a lock on it, you know. It's not some cheap book. It's kind of like you might think about it, looks like something from an old library, or maybe it looks biblical, whatever. It's a major league book, and this bug is the introduction to the book. So does that mean your conscience is the introduction to the book? Well, maybe that is what it means. It's certainly what's being played out in the movie. Well, then the cricket opens the book, and so then what do you see? Well, what does that look like? What does it look like? What does it remind you of? Okay, so that's the Van Gogh painting. It's a nativity scene. It's the Christmas star. And you know that because what's going to happen? Well, the hero is going to be born. That's what happens, and so a star signifies that. Why does a star signify the birth of an infant, let's say? Well, because there's something miraculous about the birth of an infant. And why would the infant be a savior, which is the Christian notion, say? Well, because that's what the infant is, potentially. Every infant. And so that's how you should act about them. And you know, one of the things that really is interesting about having little kids, and I loved having little kids, is that you have this opportunity to have this pristine relationship with someone, like a relationship you've never had with anyone, because the kid really is just there to love you. You're like, if you don't screw it up, you've got that. And then you can keep that going, you know, and you can try to keep that relationship like pristine, and that's so fun. It's so fun to try to do that. It's really, it's amazing. It's an amazing thing. And you know, kids get a bad rap in our society, but it's an amazing thing to have little kids. And they are remarkable, and they give you back far more than they require from you, and partly because they treat you like you're valuable beyond belief. That's what the kid thinks about you. It's like, that's pretty good. So yeah, it's like something divine is going to happen. It's so, okay, fine, you know, fair enough. Well, there's the star signifying that, and that's associated in some way with this star that you're supposed to wish upon. Well, that's kind of odd. Like there's this relationship that's implicit. The star that signifies the birth of the hero is the same star that you wish upon. Okay, so the cricket comes into the village there, and he sees this like little house, and there's a little fire in it, and so it's kind of got a welcoming place. It's a light in the darkness, this house, just like the star. And so he hops towards it, and then he ends up inside it, and you know, there's a nice fire, and you get to see the inside, and the inside's, it's cozy, you know, it's welcoming. And then when you look around, you see that everything's kind of in its place. It's not hyper organized or anything like that. It's friendly and welcoming, and there's a lot of wood, and there's a nice fire, and then there's toys everywhere, and they're well constructed. So you know that whoever lives there likes children. And so if someone likes children, well, if someone doesn't like children, it's like you should run away from them very rapidly. But if they like children, well, then that's a good sign that, you know, Jesus, they're at least human. It's a start, you know. And then these things are all high quality. They're made very well. And then he's looking around to see all of this, and there's toys, and there's clocks, and they're all handmade. And so he sort of infers that maybe there's a woodcarver who lives there, and a woodcarver is someone who can build things, and if you build things that work and that are beautiful, that's a kind of truth, right? It's like it's built right into the object. That's what quality is. Quality is the building into an object of truth. The thing works. It does what it's supposed to. It has integrity, and so you see that everywhere in here. And so you're getting a sense of the filmmakers are setting the stage, and so. Well, so they set the stage by showing you the stage, and the cricket tells you what he sees, and he's pretty happy to be there because, and this is also someone who's concerned about time, right? Because there's a lot of clocks, and so time turns out to be an important sub-element of this story. And then he sees the puppet. He's a marionette. And so what's a marionette? Well, a marionette, and he's sitting on the shelf, a marionette is something that's quasi-animated, because it can move. It doesn't really have a soul, but it sort of acts like it has a soul, in the sense of anima and soul and animated. But a marionette is something that is being manipulated by something else behind the scenes, right? It doesn't have its own volition. It's dependent on the will of something behind the scenes. And so there's a strong implication that whatever this thing is half formed, and that it's being manipulated by unseen forces behind the facade. Well, that's a Freudian idea. That's you. That's all of you. You know, you're pulled hither and fro by unconscious forces, and some of those are biological, and some of them are cultural, you know. And you think about people who are swept up in great ideological movements like the communists or the fascists. It's like those people are marionettes. That's exactly what they are. They all say the same thing. They all mouth the same words. They all act the same way, and something's behind it. And the question is, what? Well, that is the question, and that's partly what this movie tries to figure out. So you see this marionette. He's a half-formed, wooden-headed puppet, and he has a little bit of potential, you know, and the cricket goes up and interacts with him and sees that he's made out of pretty good wood and makes a little joke about having a wooden head, and you know, that's kind of obvious what that means. And you notice the cricket is dressed like a tramp. And when you first saw him, he wasn't. He was dressed like a 1920s millionaire. So, but here he's a tramp, and this is so interesting. It's like, so this bug that's a messiah, that's the introduction to the book, that's the conscience, is also a tramp with no home. It's like, what does that mean? And it took me a long time to sort that out. And it's like, he's been everywhere, this tramp. He's been everywhere. And he knows, he's traveled the world, but he doesn't have a place. He doesn't have a home. He hasn't made a relationship with anything real yet. He's kind of a potential. And this is one of the things that's really interesting about this movie, because if you think about the cricket as a fragment of the hero, and say a reflection of the savior, which is his relationship with JC, of course, and the person who introduces the book, then the story gets strange, because if it was merely a representation of the perfect person, the archetype of the hero, then the conscience would know everything, right? And it would just tell the puppet what to do, and that would be the end of it. But that, first of all, that's a dull story. It's like perfect conscience comes along, puppet does everything it says, bingo, perfection. But that isn't what happens. There's this weird idea that this thing that's got all these attributes needs a home and has to enter into a learning relationship with the thing that it's trying to transform. It's so sophisticated, because, you know, I could say, you should do what your conscience tells you. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe that's not exactly how it works. Maybe your conscience isn't omniscient and omnipotent. Maybe it's not God, right? It's a guide. But it's maybe smarter than you sometimes, maybe because it's society in your head. And obviously it's smarter than you sometimes, because it tells you not to do something and you go do it, and then you get into trouble and you think, well, if I would have just listened, but you don't. And that's interesting too. It's something that you don't have to listen to, which seems to be associated with free will. It's weird. It's like, if your conscience knows what to do, why aren't you just a deterministic puppet of your conscience? Christ, that would work a lot better. You wouldn't have to torture yourself, and you wouldn't make any mistakes. So why the separation? Well, maybe it's because the conscience is generic, and so it has to be taught. It has to learn too. And so what you do is you have a dialogue with your conscience. It's something like that, and then you expose yourself to more and more of the world, and you get wiser and your conscience gets wiser, and you mature together. And that's what happens in this story, because the cricket starts out as this tramp that, you know, is smarter than the puppet, but not as smart as he thinks he is, that's for sure. And when he first starts to operate as a conscience, he's completely useless at it. He babbles off a lot of cliches about morality, and then he's late the first day for his job. Well, so then Geppetto shows up, and he's a kindly old guy, which is pretty much exactly what you'd expect. And you know, he's a careful craftsman, and he likes kittens, and you know, that's always a good thing. And he has some fish, and you know, he's good at making things, and he's got a sense of humor, and he's kind of playful, and so he's the good father, fundamentally. He's the wise king. He's the positive archetype of the masculine. And that's what he is. And so he's culture in its positive manifestation, and he gives rise to this creation, which is his puppet, which is what culture does, because you're a puppet of your culture. You're a marionette of your culture. And so maybe you could be more than that. And that's the other thing that's strange about this movie, and it's strange about the mythological way of looking at the world, because scientifically, deterministically, there's nature and there's culture, and you are the deterministic product of the interaction between nature and culture. There's nothing else to you than that. That's that. But the mythological world doesn't say that. It says something different. It says that there's nature and culture, and then there's you. And the you that's in there has choices and a destiny, and that you actually affect the interplay of nature and culture in determining your own character. And it insists upon that. The oldest stories we have, there's always the hero and the archetypal mother and the archetypal father. There's always those three things. There's never just two. So from the narrative perspective, there's always the implication that there's something autonomous about the hero of the story. Anyway, so Geppetto comes along, and he's going to finish off the puppet. And so what does he do to finish off the puppet? He gives it a voice. He gives it a mouth. Well, that's really, really interesting. So in Genesis, this is a very, very, very complex idea, and it took people thousands of years to figure this idea out. And it's something like this. So at the beginning of everything there was chaos, and that was like potential. It was something like potential, the potential for being. And God, who's God the Father in the Genesis account, uses a faculty that he has, which is the word, to call being from chaos, and that's the creation of being, right? It's the manifestation of order from chaos, and it's the word, the logos, that it's the logos that's the tool that God uses to do that. And that logos in Christianity is associated with Christ, which is a very weird thing. But the reason for that is that there's an idea that the divine element of the individual is the thing that uses language, communicative language, to call the world into being. And that is what we do. As far as we can tell, it's like you make a decision, you think it through, you talk it over with your friends, you plot a course, and the world manifests itself in relationship to your choice. And it's for that reason, and it is for that reason, that in Genesis and in many other accounts, that logos capacity is identified with human beings. It's like you have a small bit of that in you, whatever that means, and you participate in the process of continually generating order out of chaos, and sometimes the reverse. You mediate between them. And so, and that in Western culture, and it's certainly the case in other cultures as well, that's why you have rights. Fundamentally, that's why the law has to respect you, is because you've got this spark of divinity in you that's transcendent, that nobody gets to transgress against. And you say, well, do you believe that? It's like, well, you act like you believe it. You treat other people like you believe it, or they're not very happy with you. So it depends on what you mean by believe. You act it out. Well, do you accept it as a proposition? Well, I don't care if you accept it as a proposition, frankly, because I think the best indicator of what you believe is how you act, not what you say. Because what do you know about what you know? Hardly anything. And so actions speak louder than words. And if you want to be treated properly by someone, what that means is that you want them to treat you as a valuable, autonomous entity. That's what you want. And so maybe you're not that. Maybe you're a deterministic puppet. And what this strange movie suggests is that you are kind of a deterministic puppet, but that you don't have to be. All right? Well, the mouth goes on. And then Geppetto's happy about that, and then they have a little dance. You know, they turn the music on, and all these little music boxes, and they all play together, and it's like harmony of some sort has been established, because that's what the music represents, and there's layers of reality that are communicating with one another, because that's what the music represents. And then they have a little dance, and the idea is that, well, it's a good thing to let this puppet have its own voice. Well, that's an interesting idea, because what the hell does it know? It's a wooden-headed marionette. Why the hell would you want something like that to talk? Well, it's the same question you have in relationship to your children. It's like, what do they know? They're 2 or 3, you know, they don't know anything. Well, so should you just like tyrannize them and make them do everything you want, or are you going to let them have a bit of a voice? And the question is, it depends on whether you want them to be a puppet or not. And if you don't want them to be a puppet, if you want them to grow up autonomous, then you let them have a voice, and you facilitate the development of that voice. And so and that's what you do if you don't want a marionette. So, and Geppetto doesn't want a marionette, so he gives the puppet a voice, even though he knows it's just a puppet, and that it doesn't know anything. And then, this is fantastic. So the cricket's sitting up there watching that. He's pretty happy with it. That's the first little scene you see there. And he's sitting by this other thing that is just not happy at all. And that's the terrible father. And you see, it's a character that repeats throughout the entire movie. You see manifestations of the tyrannical father continually through the movie in different characters, like he's played out by different roles. And so, first of all, the cricket is so thrilled about this, and then he looks at the frowning king there, who is not happy that the puppet has been given a voice. He's a tyrant, right? He's the representation of a tyrant, and a tyrant does not want you to have a voice. And so the cricket looks at him and says, well, you can't please everybody all the time. And it's just this tiny little fragment of a joke, you know, but there's this old idea I think it comes from Chekhov, and the idea is that if you set a play up and there's a gun, a rifle, or a pistol on a table in the first act, it better have been used by the third act, or it shouldn't have been there at all. And the idea is, you don't put anything in your play that's random. You never do that. It's like, because this isn't life. This isn't life. This is a work of art, and everything is connected, and it's it's there by intent. And so this isn't accidental that this little king character doesn't like what's going on, or that he shows up. So anyways, all the clocks go off and the music boxes go, and they have a little dance, and everybody's happy about it. And then Geppetto notices what time it is, and so there's a tremendous emphasis on time in this part of the movie, because all these clocks are going off, and they're all telling him what time it is. Like 30 clocks go off, and then he takes his watch out and notices what time it is. It's like the idea that there's something about time going on is like whacked at you, dozens of times so that you get it. And it's a little joke that he, pulls out his watch and he figures out it's time for bed. Well, so now we're making a transition between the conscious world and the unconscious world. Okay, so there's an intimation in the movie that everything that happens now is in the unconscious world. And the way you know that is that it's strange, because the movie moves in and out of this underworld. But at the very end, when Pinocchio is transformed into a real boy, the last thing Geppetto does is, I think it's Geppetto, is hit one of the pendulums and start all the clocks again. So it's as if what happens from here onwards is part of a dream. Now it's murky, because Pinocchio goes to school, and there's the next day and all of that, and so those are sort of realistic elements. But then there's also the whole going down into the ocean to find the whale thing, which seems completely dreamlike. But there's an intimation that we're in a different kind of world, and so they all go to sleep, including the cricket. And so then Geppetto notices the star, and because he's a good guy, he makes a wish on the star. We've already explained why you might wish on a star and what that might mean. And he makes a very interesting wish. It's not a self-serving wish. In fact, it's quite the contrary. He doesn't wish that Pinocchio is an obedient son. He doesn't wish that he's produced someone who will work for him. He doesn't wish any of that. He wishes what a good father would wish, which is that the creation that he's brought forth would develop its capacity for autonomy. He wants him to become real. He wants him to become an actual living creature and not a wooden-headed marionette. And so you'd say, well, that is what your father should wish for you, and I have clients frequently whose fathers weren't like that at all. They were tyrannical, or they were neglectful, or they punished the person every time they did something good. That's a real fun game. They competed with them and undermined them at every opportunity. They didn't want to produce someone strong and autonomous. They wanted to give birth to a slave and then diminish it as much as possible. And so that's bad. It's not good. And so Geppetto's not like that. So he says, well, I'm going to wish for something completely unreasonable, which is that part of that ideal idea, right? And the unreasonable thing is that this puppet could become real, could actually take on its autonomy and move forward. And so that's what he wishes. And then they go to sleep. And then the cricket starts to become driven mad by the noises of the clock. And so it's like he's going into this sort of state of hyper alertness, and the clocks are clanging at him, and Geppetto is snoring, and he can even hear the little grains of sand falling out of the hourglass. He's becoming hyper alert. And then he yells, stop, and all the clocks stop, which is a pretty good trick for a cricket. It's like he's the master of time, but also we're in a place now where time has come to a stop. We're outside of time. And then the star enlarges, and it turns into this blue fairy who's got a celestial gown covered with stars, and who's got wings, so she's kind of some ethereal being. And like, you don't have a problem with that in the movie. It's like, yeah, sure, I mean, it's a fairy, it came from a star, that makes perfect sense, which of course it makes no sense whatsoever, right? It makes no sense, but you're willing to go along with it, because on the one hand it makes no sense, and on the other hand it makes perfect sense. It's like the fairy godmother idea. It's like, yeah, fairy godmother, no problem, we got that. And the idea there is that, well, nature comes to your aid. It's something like that. It's that the benevolent force of nature is on your side. Now, not obviously only on your side, because it opposes you as well, and there's your own mother as well, who's also nature, who's on your side. And so, but there's an idea here, and the idea is that if the father gets the wish right, the aim right for the child, then nature will cooperate. So anyways, the fairy shows up, and she's quite sexually attractive, she's quite provocative, and she charms the cricket, and who gets all blushes and like is all, you know, embarrassed and overwhelmed by this like figure of celestial beauty, and decides to cooperate. The conscience decides to cooperate and gets some responsibility. And so the fairy allows the puppet to move without strings. So that's kind of interesting. So it's the intervention of nature. Culture focuses the aim, then it's the intervention of nature that produces the autonomy. And that seems to be right. I mean, even though it's not that understandable, it seems to be right. And then, so she takes the strings off Pinocchio. And you might say, well, that's partly because your child is certainly not just a creature of culture. By no means. Your child has a temperament. You'll see that right away. And that temperament will unfold. And hopefully it'll unfold in a cultural context that's amenable to it. And that the combination of those two things will produce something new. He can talk. He can walk. And so the good fairy basically tells him that he's got a bit of autonomy, and now it's up to him to like clue in a bit and act properly and learn the difference between good and evil and to speak truthfully and all that. It's a bit propagandistic, that part of the movie, I would say, but it doesn't really matter. It's kind of inculcation of conventional morality, and there's a fair bit to it, especially that he's supposed to tell the truth. And you know, he says he will, and the cricket's listening, and then the puppet asks, well, what does conscience mean? Because the fairy says, always let your conscience be your guide. And he says, well, what does conscience mean? And then the bug, who's like all puffed up because he wants to impress the fairy, pops down and gets on his little matchbox and gives this like horrible little lecture about how to behave properly. That's just like ideological chatter. You can hardly even stand listening to it. And it's supposed to be like that. It's generic moral advice that anyone could give that's kind of dull and also puffed up and grandiose, and he's just not very good at it. So, and that's why he's on his little matchbox there with his chest puffed out. And so he says, that's just the trouble with the world today. And I think that's his opening line, you know, that he's diagnosing the whole world. And, you know, the fairy, she thinks he's kind of funny because he is. And, you know, it's sort of, there's a real interesting thing here going on because he's male and he's all puffed up with his knowledge, which is completely shallow, and then he's put in contact with this like celestial feminine ideal, and he just turns into a complete moron. And that's exactly what happens to men. It happens to them all the time. So anyways, she decides to give him a chance and turns him into this conscience, and all of a sudden he's this like 1920s millionaire. So he's been ennobled. But then she tells him that, you know, he has to journey along with Pinocchio in order for things to go properly, and he promises that he'll be a good conscience and do it, and he already thinks that he can do it, and that's why he's on the matchbox podium, you know, espousing his morality, but the reality turns out to be much more complex. So the bug has a little talk with the cricket. The bug has a little talk with the puppet, and the bug tries to tell Pinocchio explicitly what it means to be good, and he gets completely tangled up in the explanation because what the hell does he know, and the puppet doesn't understand anything that he says anyways. And so there's a message there, and the message is the kind of knowledge that the conscience and the puppet are supposed to co-create is not something that you can articulate easily as a table of rules. It's not like that, because life is too complicated to just have 5 rules that you live by and that will solve every problem. Partly because the rules will conflict. That's a huge part of the problem, right? One moral guideline contradicts another in a situation. It's like you don't know what to do. So anyways, they decide that they're just going to he says, Pinocchio says, well, I'll be a good boy, and the cricket says, well, that's the spirit. And then, well, then Geppetto gets wind of it, and they have a little like horror episode, and then he finds out that the puppet is autonomous, and they have a little party, which tells you exactly what Geppetto's up to. Is the autonomy emerges, and he's happy about it. So it's stamping home the notion that Geppetto is in fact a good guy, and that is in fact what he wants. So it's like the encouragement of your father is a precondition for the emergence of your individuality. And it also allows the feminine to play a role, both as nature and perhaps as mother. And the combination of those two things produces the autonomous individual. It's like, well, that seems perfectly reasonable. So off they go to sleep. Next day they wake up, and it's a new day, and Pinocchio is off to school. And that's a good thing too, because Geppetto isn't, and he's really excited about it. And so what that means is that he's been parented properly, and he's going to go out into the world of his peers, which is where he belongs, and Geppetto isn't too worried about it. In fact, he's pushing him out the door, you know. It's like, go, you can do it, this is the next thing. The kid isn't cowering in the corner and overcome by terror, and with the parents freaking out about all the things that are going to go wrong. There's some faith in his ability. So he sees all the kids wandering by, and Geppetto dresses him up and sends him off to school. And so that's good. So that's a happy family story. It's like mom and dad got together, they decided that the kid was going to, you know, be competent and autonomous and ready to face the world, and so out he goes. And so he's like 5 years old at this point. The blue fairy, so I would say the benevolent element of Mother Nature in the schemata that we're going to use to investigate mythology, had more or less been allowed her entrance because Geppetto was a good guy and because he wished for the right thing. And so in some sense, here's a way of thinking about that. You know, genetic/environmental studies of children's temperament have revealed something quite interesting, which is that the shared environment that children have within a family, so that would be what's the same about your environment and your brother's environment, to say, doesn't have that much effect on your temperament or his temperament. Because the presumption always was that within a family there was a shared environment, right? That something was common about the environment to every child within that environment. But there isn't much of a shared environmental effect on temperament. So then you could say, well, that makes it appear as though parenting isn't that relevant in relationship to the development of temperament. But you could also suggest something else. You could suggest that if parenting is occurring properly, the effect of the shared environment should be very close to zero. And the reason for that is that you establish an individual relationship with each child. And the environment is actually a microenvironment that's composed of your observations of your child and that specific child's interaction with you. And to some degree, if there's a shared environment, that means that you're enforcing the same principles on every child. And so my suspicions are, although I don't know this and the research hasn't been done, that in bad families there's a shared environmental effect, but in good families that minimizes. And so that lets the child's biological predisposition, roughly, manifest itself with support and in some positive manner. Well, I don't want to extend the analogy too far, but you could imagine that and this is what this film proposes, is that if you aim properly in relationship to your child, what you're trying to do is to establish an individual relationship and to allow them to move towards whatever their particular expression of individuality happens to be. And that's, well, that would be the same as allowing nature to take its course in some sense, at least nature in its positive guise, and that's exactly what happens here. Now, so, okay, now, you see that, back to the movie, you see that happening in this movie. I mean, it's very, very quick, but the blue fairy turns the bug into the conscience, and then the bug tries to explain to Pinocchio what the rules of morality are. But the thing is, the bug doesn't know, because he's just a bug, and you know, he's just not omniscient. So the best he can do is to come up with like a propagandistic, semantic, verbal representation that's internally contradictory, and when he tells Pinocchio, Pinocchio has no idea what he's talking about, and neither does the bug. That's the thing. And so, well, so what happens is this: the cricket says, well, Pinocchio, maybe you and I had better have a little heart-to-heart talk. And the puppet says, why? And the cricket says, well, you want to be a real boy, don't you? All right, sit down, son. Now you see the world is full of temptations. Temptations? Yes, temptations. They're the wrong things that seem right at the time. But even though the right things may seem wrong sometimes, sometimes the wrong things may be right at the wrong time, or vice versa. Understand? No. No. And neither did the cricket. And that's actually very nicely done in that piece of the movie, because as soon as you just want to slap him as soon as he starts talking like that, because, well, he gets up on his little matchbox and lectures, and he's dull and tyrannical both at the same time. And so there's nothing genuine about what he's saying. He's sort of imitating something that isn't him, so he's really acting like a puppet at that point too, and it doesn't work at all. And so Pinocchio says, I'm going to try to be a good boy, and the cricket says, well, that's the spirit, son, and then away they go. So all right, so then we're at the next day, because this all happens in one night. We're at the next day, and you know, it's a nice day, and there's these birds flying around. That's a bit of foreshadowing there, you know. So you have to remember, when you watch something like this movie, not a single bit of it is random or accidental. None of it. Because, you know, they had to draw, I don't remember how many frames per second these things are, 30 maybe. Maybe it's a little less than that, but it's high quality animation. And so someone had to paint 30 pictures to get a second of this. You're not doing that accidentally. It's really expensive, and everyone has to agree on exactly what's going to happen. And you might say, well, do the people who are doing this consciously know what they're doing? And the answer to that is, well, sort of, just like you do. You know, it's yes, they know, and no, they don't. And they know because they're really smart and gifted and all that, but they don't know because it's not all articulated, plus they're working in a group. So they know and don't know, just like you do when you're watching it. And these are used later in the movie as manifestations of the Holy Spirit, roughly speaking. And of course that's a standard Christian symbol, although, as I mentioned, the dove often represents the Holy Spirit, and we'll talk about that later. But this movie has very strong pagan elements in it, as I mentioned before, as opposed to strictly Christian symbolism. But that's a foreshadowing. And what it foreshadows is that, well, a new day has dawned. It's the emergence of new consciousness. And everything last night went well, really well. Everything in the, let's call it the unconscious, say, after time stops. That all went well, and so the new day is full of promise. And so the birds are singing and the sun is shining, and like, hooray. This is the next scene, right? So it sets the tenor for that scene, just like the introductory song does. So anyways, then you see all these kids playing and enthusiastic, so they're off to school, which is presented in a positive light, and so that's how where you get socialized. So Pinocchio is ready to go beyond the boundaries of the familial home. And he's ready because his father prepared him and because his mother prepared him. And so he goes off, and he's not going off alone, he's going with his conscience, and which is sort of the you could think about it again as the internalized representation of nature and society. And so he's not going out there alone, even though he's not very good at it. And so he's pretty excited about this, and so is Geppetto. See, Geppetto isn't standing there paralyzed with terror, and the kid isn't phobic of the outside world. And so that's, he's treating it as an adventure. I mean, even though, well, it's an adventure, but adventures can be dangerous. What if you can imagine a kid, especially one who's like high neuroticism, who hasn't been encouraged sufficiently to overcome that, let's say. Their primary idea might be, well, what if the other kids don't like me? That's a big one. What if the teachers don't like me? What if the other kids won't play with me? It's like, yeah, what if? That's rough, man. And if you're not a playful kid, it could easily be the case. So, but that's not Pinocchio. He's like spinning out, ready to go. And so, good. He's got naive, but enthusiastic. Okay, well, that at least gets the ball rolling. Now, you've got these two evil creatures here, the fox and the cat. I think this one's based on one of the Marx brothers, actually, Harpo Marx, who I believe never said anything. But be that as it may, they're these ne'er-do-well characters. The fox in particular. Now, fox is a standard trickster animal, right? It's a classic animal, maybe because it's good at hiding and it's good at hunting. I don't know exactly why, but and coyotes are like that too. They're classic trickster animals. He's kind of like Wile E. Coyote, in fact, you know, the Warner Brothers character who's genius at large, and of course whose arrogance continually gets him walloped. And this character has a lot of features like that, but he feigns being an English gentleman of like the 1890s and pretends to be educated, and he has a kind of high-blown way of talking, and he's a fraud through and through. And he's got this, you know, sidekick who is barely there at all, and he doesn't treat him that well, but he's got someone to lord it over, so that keeps his dominance hierarchy thing going well. And the fact that he's like a second-rate companion, well, he never really notices that, although he'll treat him contemptuously whenever he gets a chance. So anyways, they're walking down the street, and the fox is bragging away about some crooked thing that he's done and how he pulled the wool over someone's eyes, and he confuses that with wisdom and intelligence. And one of the things that you see, this is worth knowing too, because if you're preyed upon by a psychopath, which you will be to some degree at some point in your life, the psychopath, who will be narcissistic, will presume that you're stupid and that you deserve to be taken advantage of because you're naive and stupid. So it's actually a good thing that he's doing it. And his proof for, and I'm saying he because there are more male psychopaths, the proof that you're stupid, naive, is that he can take advantage of you. And so, like, if you were wiser, you'd be, you know, you'd know his tricks, and then it wouldn't be morally necessary for him to show you just exactly who knows what about what. And so the psychopath will use his ability to fool you as proof of his own grandiose omnipotence, omniscience, and narcissism. And the problem with that is that you can be fooled by a psychopath, and virtually anybody can. So anyways, you got these two-bit hoods here who think they're really something. They also think they're tough and dangerous, and they're not. They're just, you know, cowardly and corner dwellers, and they confuse their unwillingness to abide by reasonable rules as indication of their heroic courage, which is something else that low-rent hoods like to do, you know. And it's partly because lots of people who just attend to the law do that because they're cowardly, which is a Nietzschean observation. Are you good, or are you just afraid? Well, let's start with afraid first, before we proceed to good. And that the reason that you follow the rules is because you're afraid of getting caught. So anyways, they're talking about some exploits, and then they see that this character named Stromboli, who's a marionette, he has a puppet show, right? And he's kind of a wheeler dealer too. And remember, I showed you that mask that was glaring at Pinocchio when he got his voice? It's like Stromboli is one of his manifestations. The fox here is another one of his manifestations. And all the negative characters throughout the movie are manifestations of the same thing. It's partly the adversarial individual, and it's partly the tyrannical aspect of society. It's the negative masculine. That's one way of thinking about it. So, and you know, when men go bad, they often go bad by being antisocial and tyrannical. So, you know, where there's way more antisocial men than there are antisocial women, which is why there's 20 times as many men in jail as there are women. You know, so each gender, let's say each sex, has its own characteristic pathologies. And there are some antisocial women, you know, and there are some high neuroticism guys who are, or some guys who are really agreeable as well. So, but they're rarer. So anyways, he sees this poster advertising Stromboli's puppet show. So Stromboli's a puppet master. Now that's really worth thinking about, because that's an archetypal theme, or it's at least attached to an archetypal theme. Something's behind the scenes pulling the strings. And everybody always wonders what that is, right? What's actually going on? What's actually going on with Trump? Who's actually in control? Is it Putin? I mean, that's the fantasies of the left. It's Putin. It's like, well, the question always is, what's going on behind the scene, right? And the question is, that's the case certainly on the political landscape, business landscape, interpersonal relations. What are you really up to? Everyone's always wondering that, right there. Anyways, what's going on behind the scenes? Well, if you look at Stromboli, you might be thinking, it's not clear he's someone you'd want to have pulling your strings. Like, there's a little bit of forced enthusiasm, let's say, there, and he's just not a very savory looking character. So anyways, the fox knows him, and they start talking about Stromboli, that old joker, and then how they could possibly involve him in some sort of scam because he's back in town. And then they see the puppet, and the fox does his equivalent of thinking, which is, you know, pretty sad and nasty, but that's what he does. And then they see this puppet with no strings, and they think, hey man, a puppet master would pay a lot for something that is capable of semi-autonomous movement like that. It would be kind of a miracle. And so they decide that they're going to take him to Stromboli. And so they grab him, and he's got an apple to take to the teacher, which I think it's the cat promptly eats. And the fox acts out this sort of false enthusiasm about what Pinocchio is up to and pretends that he's his friend, which is of course what your typical pedophile will do. And so this is in the same kind of category, and it truly is. So, and one of the things that's interesting to know about pedophiles is that they're predatory, right? And so they don't go after kids that are assertive and likely to be noisy. They watch. And they watch to see if they can find a kid who's defeated, and that's good enough. Who's defeated, and who's going to need a friend, and who's not going to object. And so when they check out, these are the ones who do the stranger abductions, which are, by the way, extraordinarily rare. They look for a victim type. They look for a kid who's going to be easy to take down. And so, you know, that's one thing you don't want. So you might think, well, one of the things that was really big, and it's probably even worse now, when I was a parent of young children, was to teach your kids how to be afraid of strangers. It's like, no, wrong. That is not what you teach them. Because all you do is teach them then to be timid and fearful, and the real predatory types, they're pretty much thrilled about that, because you'll also make them sheltered and naive, you know. So that isn't, you make your kids courageous and you get their damn eyes open, and that's the best thing you can do to protect them against people who are truly dangerous. So none of that terrifying them. It's not a good idea. Anyways, the fox befriends the puppet, and then they come up with this evil scheme to get him off to Stromboli, the puppet master, and away they go. And they sing a little song about being an actor's life for me. And this took me a long time to figure out. I thought, they're taking Pinocchio away to be an actor. Now, why in the world are actors getting such a rough time in this movie? It's like, it's a Hollywood movie, you know. It's acting, obviously, the voiceovers and all that are acting. It's, why, what is this thing about being an actor? And then I thought, oh, I get it. I see what's going on. They sing to Pinocchio about the delights of unearned celebrity. So he doesn't have to go and get an education. He doesn't have to take the difficult route. He can take the easy way to dominance, to success, to dominant success. He can circumvent all the hard work and go right to the top. You know, and when you think about phenomena like the Kardashian family and how popular they are, part of that is this desire that people have for unearned celebrity, because you can get to the top without any sacrifices and without any work. And if you're really cynical, you know, you think that the people at the top are just there by accident anyways, and it might as well be you. And of course there's a lot of naivety in that as well, and a fair bit of, you know, not a fair lack of wisdom and all of that. But the actor idea here is that you can pretend to be something you're not, and that's the proper route of anyone wise to success. It's the ultimate in cynicism, and it's a nihilistic perspective as well, and that's how they entrap him. They say, look, why are you bothering to go to school? That's going to take 18 years. With all of your talents, you can just go on the stage, your name will be up in lights, you'll be at the top in no time. And what does the puppet know? And plus he does have some talents. He is, after all, a semi-autonomous puppet. Now, he doesn't exactly know how special that makes him, but the fox can obviously see something in him. And he's good at playing that naivety off and then offering these false promises. But see, the thing is, one of the things that Carl Jung said that I thought was really interesting when he was talking about the Oedipal situation in families, I never forgot this. So the Oedipal situation, roughly speaking, is when, I'll lay out the classic story, is when a child is seriously overprotected, usually a male child by his mother. Now the reverse can be the case, and it can be a female child by the mother and all of that, but I'll just talk about the classic case to begin with. Now, what Freud observed was that there were usually not very good boundaries in families like that. And so the relationship between the husband and the wife was either strained or non-existent. And the wife would often turn to the child to be what she isn't getting from the husband. But one of the things Jung said, which I loved, and you can really see this in the Crumb documentary, is that the Oedipal mother basically entices the child. Says, look, here's the deal. You don't have to do anything, but you don't get to leave. But if you don't leave and you don't do these difficult things, then I'll take care of you. And the child has a choice all the way along there. I mean, obviously, he's outclassed in some sense, but it's not as obvious as you'd think. Little kids are tough, and they make decisions all the time. And so Jung thought about it more as a conspiracy than as something imposed on the child by the mother. And I really like, it's actually a conspiracy between mother, father, and child, actually. And I think that's a good way of looking at it, even though it's really rough, because, well, should you hold the child responsible? Well, yes, but judiciously and not completely, because then if you deal with someone like that as an adult, and they're trying to escape from it, you have to go all the way back and figure out how the hell it happened, and then they have to adjust, they have to figure out where they opened the door, like inviting a vampire in, because they can't come in unless you invite them in, you know. So don't invite them in, because once they're in, they're really hard to get rid of, and they'll take all your blood. So that's a cautionary tale. So anyways, Pinocchio doesn't know any better, and he's got the egotism of, you know, of youth, and he's offered the easy way to success, which is exactly what the fox tells him, and off they go to see Stromboli. So this is the song. I'm not going to read it all. It's great to be a celebrity in actor's life for me. You sleep till after 2, you promenade a big cigar, you tour the world in a private car, you dine on chicken and caviar, an actor's life for me. So it's all this idea of wealth and public exposure and zero attention whatsoever to anything regarding responsibility or discipline or learning. And so it's a dual attraction, right? You get everything you want and you don't have to do anything. Jeez, what a deal. And so that's what the actor represents. It's a liar, fundamentally. It's someone who's acting out a deception. They're a persona in the Jungian sense. So the persona is the mask you wear in public, that you might even think you are, but you're not. It's this mask, and that's the actor, that's the persona. So the fox and the cat are inviting the puppet to only become a persona. And that's, see, for Jung, you start as a persona. And then when you start to investigate the parts of you that don't really fit in that persona, that would be the shadow, then you start understanding who you really are. And that's shocking, because the persona contains everything, roughly speaking, that you think is good, and maybe even that your immediate culture thinks is good. And then the shadow contains everything that's not part of that. And some of that's really bad. But some of it is good disguised as bad, and you can't break out of the persona and transcend it until you incorporate a lot of what's in the shadow. And so, for example, if you're an extraordinarily compassionate person, let's say, 98th percentile will say, you're going to be sacrificing yourself to other people all the time. And there are people who will find that extraordinarily endearing. And it will be under some circumstances, but the problem is that you will sacrifice yourself. And that's a really bad attitude to have, for example, towards adult males. It's a great thing for infants, but for adult males, it is the wrong approach. And so you will get taken advantage of continually by people who are looking for someone like you until you grow some teeth. And you'll think, no, that's the opposite of compassion. Being able to bite hard is the opposite of compassion, which it is. And so you'll have that pushed into the predator category. I'm not doing that. I'm not getting angry. I don't like conflict. It's like until you bring that out of the depths and put it on so you can use it, you're going to be in trouble. And that's kind of Nietzsche's idea of the revaluation of good and evil, right? You have a sense of what's good and a sense of what isn't with your conscience, but it's not very smart. It's got things in the wrong boxes. And a lot of the things that, even nature itself, a lot of the things that you accept as untrammeled goods, like compassion, let's say, have a very dark side, first of all, and second, are not enough to get you through life. You need the opposite virtues too. And so you have to develop them. And so you get outside the persona to do that. But anyways, Pinocchio is invited to be a false persona, to take the gains of celebrity without having to do anything to be educated. He's just going to go right to the top from right where he is. And you know, people are kind of fascinated by that idea. That's why you watch America's Got Talent or The X Factor, which are shows I actually love, by the way. You never see narcissism in its purer forms than you see it when you watch people who display an absolute lack of talent and become homicidal when someone dares point it out, right? Accusatory and homicidal instantly. It's really something. And then you do see one of these people who's so introverted and so out of society and have this unbelievable gift, which is also something really remarkable to see. And it's no wonder those things are so popular. They're psychologically extraordinarily interesting. So okay, so that's the actor, first of Pinocchio's temptations. And of course it's the first one because he's entering the social world. And the temptation in the social world is to be exactly what other people want you to be. And the thing that's cool about that is what you should be doing, right? When you go out in your peers. Well, the cricket, he's supposed to be helping the puppet out, but he overslept. It's like, that's just another indication that he's not everything he could be yet. And that's really, that took me a long time to puzzle out with regards to interpreting this movie. I could not figure out, all right, I told you this, if the bug is the person who opens the hero narrative and who can guide the transformations of time and who has the same initials as Jesus Christ, it's like, and is like knighted by nature herself, why is he such an idiot? It's a very difficult thing to figure out, but the idea that the conscience isn't omniscient, even though it has that sort of, that voice of let's say, common sense. So he's feeling pretty stupid. He's got his little millionaire clothes on there, but he's really not living up to them. So he does catch up to the fox and the puppet, however, and tries to dissuade Pinocchio from going down this road. And of course, the cat, well, you can see what the cat's doing there. He's got a big hammer, big mallet, and he also shows you just exactly how much of a clue he has. He's going to wallop the bug who's sitting on the fox's hat, which I think he actually does. And you know, then the fox can't get out of his hat and has to talk through his hat, which basically is what he's doing the whole time anyways. So this I really like. So you see on the left here, the cricket is speaking inside this flower, you know. And like I said, there's nothing accidental in these representations. So these are artists who are coming up with these compositions, and their fantasy has a structure. And so the cricket is speaking out of this flower that has, well, you could think about it as, it has a sexualized element. So you could think about that as a phallic part of it, and that part of the feminine part of it. Well, they are flowers after all. They are the sex organs of plants. And so, and that's very much the same over here, as this is the yoni and lingam. This is from Hindu cultures. And so, and you see there's a snake wrapped around that. And so that's masculine and feminine with a snake wrapped around it. And that's a holy representation, you know, a sacred representation. And it represents the deepest reality. That's one way of thinking about it, like chaos and order surrounded by the snake. It's the same, exactly the same idea. And so the cricket speaks out of that. We already know that because the cricket is the conscience, and he's been awakened in part by Geppetto and the good father, and awakened in part by the good fairy and nature. And so he speaks with those voices, and he's also a manifestation of the underlying chaos itself, because nature and culture spring out of chaos. So anyways, the cricket tries to make a case for why Pinocchio shouldn't go off to be a celebrity, but you know, it's a hard case to make because the fox is very manipulative and Pinocchio is naive, and it sounds like a good offer. And also the fox is actually quite forceful. You know, he basically takes him by the hand. So the temptation is, and this is something else I like about the movie, you can't just say, well, the puppet gets what he deserves, because he's little, naive, and what he's facing is really malevolent, truly malevolent, and physically overpowering. And so the movie does a nice job of not minimizing the threat that's posed by this particular temptation. So here we are at the big event, and Pinocchio's off to be a celebrity. And the cricket is watching. And Pinocchio basically, well, he's got some natural talent because he's he's a puppet and he doesn't have strings, and he goes on stage and with strings, and then he drops the strings and the whole crowd is amazed. And the crowd should be amazed when that happens, right? You can imagine when a kid goes to school and shows some independence, that's actually going to, people are going to notice that. His peers are going to notice that, the teachers are going to notice that. Maybe it's too much independence even, right? But it's still it is a remarkable thing too, like self. So anyways, he's off on stage and Stromboli introduces him and talks about how wonderful this is going to be, and Pinocchio comes out on stage with his strings on and drops them, and then he falls down the steps and put his nose in a hole, makes a fool out of himself. And that's when Stromboli, the first time Stromboli shows his true character, because he just really yells and screams at him. And he has his back to the audience, Stromboli, while he's doing this, so he's not noticing how the audience is reacting. Typical tyrannical parent, right, who's not noticing that society is reacting a different way than him, and he's not happy about it. And Pinocchio, of course, is dazed and feels like a fool, and he is a fool, so that's appropriate. But then Stromboli hears the crowd laughing, and as soon as he turns around, he's like all smiles again. And so that's the first time you get insight into what sort of puppet master he is. He's there to please the crowd, and that's all. And he's there to look good in public, but fundamentally he's a tyrant. And so, and I guess that's the problem with false celebrity, is that the negative spirit of the crowd becomes your master, right? Because to be a celebrity, you have to be a crowd pleaser. And if you're pleasing the kind of crowd who likes a celebrity like you, which is, and there's not much reason for that, then it's not exactly like you're appealing to the proper side of the crowd, and you've become its puppet one way or another. And maybe it's rewarding you with wealth, perhaps, and with attention, but fundamentally, it's not something I would recommend if you want to stay reasonably psychologically healthy for any reasonable amount of time. All right, so anyways, Stromboli changes from the tyrant to the good father in half a second. He gives Pinocchio a pat on the head, despite the fact that he's made a mistake, looks all kind, and the show continues. Now, the cricket is not very happy about this. He's sitting in the stage watching. He's very angry and, let's say, disgusted by what's happening, partly because Pinocchio is making a fool of himself. It's an idea. Anyways, the cricket is not happy with what's going on. He's not happy about Stromboli, and he's not happy about the willingness of Pinocchio to make a fool of himself to support this false celebrity. And so, I actually think that's why the celebrity types like that often get narcissistic and arrogant. You know, it's because they aren't paying attention. They're not paying attention really to what's happening inside of them. They drown it out because the glory and the money and all that is so attractive and enticing. They don't notice, they refuse to notice what price they're paying for it, and they magnify up their grandiosity and their arrogance to keep that stuff all under control. And then of course they get surrounded by sycophants, which is a really bad thing, right? They get surrounded by people who will tell them exactly what they want to hear. And that's really bad if what you want to hear from other people is not good for you. To surround yourself with people who won't offer you genuine criticism or even genuine reward. It's the same thing. Like, well, so Pinocchio's on stage making a fool of himself, and then he gets all tangled up in other puppets' strings. That's what happens to him. And then it all ends rather badly with everything being a tangled mess on stage, but it also turns out to be rather funny. It's funny because he's surrounded by angry Russians, you know, which, you know, you could kind of view that as a potential lesson, is that if you're a puppet on a stage and you mess around too much, you just might get tangled up with a bunch of angry Russians. And these are Cossacks. That's exactly what happens. So anyways, of course, no, that's not what's happening here, but it's still funny. So Stromboli is not happy with the tangled mess, but then the crowd reacts very positively, and then that confuses the conscience because he thinks, well, look, this is horrible. This guy's a tyrant. Like, Pinocchio's making a fool of himself. Everything turns into a tangled mess, but the crowd goes crazy. And, well, being a fool, that can be entertaining, right? So it's hard to tell when a crowd, especially at a spectacle, because this crowd is at a spectacle, you just don't know exactly why it is that they're responding positively, but you've definitely given them what you want. And you can see this look on Stromboli's face. It's like this false kindness and generosity, public facing. And Oh well, anyways, the conscience is very confused, and I really think this is an important thing, but what I'm saying is that you have to be an extraordinary person, you have to be extraordinarily wise, and you have to take ridiculous precautions if you're going to put yourself in the public sphere like that and expose yourself to that kind of adulation without becoming a puppet of the crowd. And that's what happened to Hitler. I mean, it's not like he wasn't also a conscious manipulator and surrounded himself by people who were propagandists and all of that. So there was a conscious element, but you got to think these things through and see how that dialectic develops. Like, he learned how to appeal to the darkest fantasies of the crowd. He was really, really good at it. And that was a dialectic process, right? The crowd told him what they wanted to hear, and the crowd's a mob at that point. So I don't have to take responsibility for the fact that I'm screaming my approval when I'm surrounded by 1 million people. So I can scream my approval for whatever I want, for whatever dark, revengeful fantasy might be playing out in my imagination, because I'm not going to be held accountable for it. Anyways, the cricket's confused, and it's no wonder. It's like the public has rendered its judgment, and the judgment is positive. So when I wrote the book on which this course is based, I was thinking, how am I going to judge its success? And then I thought, well, there's sort of there's a 2x2 matrix of success. You could say, it's a great book, no one reads it. That happens. So what do you do about that? It's like, Nietzsche sold virtually nothing in his lifetime, right? And you know that's happened to lots of artists. So then it's a terrible book and everyone loves it. That happens too. And then it's a great book and everyone loves it. And then it's a terrible book and everyone hates it. That's probably a better category, actually, that like it's a terrible book and everyone loves it. I mean, you wouldn't pick a terrible book that everyone hates if you had a choice. But at least the quality and the response match. At least it's truthful, like great book, good response. But the problem with those 4 categories is you can't really tell which category your production falls into, right? Because how do you know? And I think you should assume horrible book, bad response, because that's the most likely, of all 4 of those categories, that's the one that's most likely to be true, but just, purely on actuarial grounds, let's say. So, all right, so anyways, the cricket wanders away because he obviously, not only was he late for work that day, but he turned out to be wrong about everything. So he lets Pinocchio go off on his adventure, and Stromboli puts him in this little kind of like a touring wagon, and away they go. And the cricket thinks, well, the conscience isn't needed anymore on this journey towards unearned celebrity. Well, meanwhile, back at the ranch, as they say, the puppet is supposed to come home after school. But he doesn't. He doesn't show up. And the kitten and the fish and Geppetto are all waiting there for him, ready to eat. Excuse me. But he doesn't show up. And so Geppetto goes out into the rain to look for him, and he can't find him. And then we see the inside of the traveling show cart, and Stromboli is having a snack and counting all the money that he's made from tonight's performance and hypothetically dividing it up with a puppet. So he's got this little stack of gold, and some of it's false. So somebody paid with looks like a little washer, like a mechanical washer, and it's bent. And so he curses about that for a while, even though it's interesting, because he's made all this money, it's been really successful, but this one little error is enough to enrage him, which is very ungrateful and tyrannical. It's like, look, you got 100 gold pieces, someone slipped you a fake one. It's like, you could have had 101. It's still a pretty good day, all things considered. You got to make a bit of allowance for error, which is something a tyrant does not do. So, and that's perfect, because if you don't make allowance for error at all, then people are always guilty of something. And if you're a tyrant, that's exactly what you want. And people are always guilty of something. So the tyrant who's willing to exploit that is always on solid ground. So anyways, he doesn't share with Pinocchio. and he puts him in a birdcage, a jail, and then he also shows him this other puppet that has an axe through him that was the previous puppet who didn't precisely perform as he was supposed to, and so there's a big threat there. It's like, you stay in that jail, you do exactly what I want, or it's off to the woodpile for you to be burned. And so, well, that's just worth thinking about, because that's kind of what happens with tyrants. And so, and literally, not just metaphorically. So the cricket is basically wondering what in the world he should do, and then the cart rolls by and he gets an inkling, or hears, and I don't quite remember this, that Pinocchio is in there and might be in trouble, or he thinks that up. I'm sorry, I can't remember that, but he ends up inside the cart. He finds the traveling cart and he goes inside, and then he tries to pick the lock, because he's a bug, he can climb inside. He tries to pick the lock, he tries to get Pinocchio out of the jail that he's sort of collaborated himself into, you know. And it's interesting, because if you read, for example, if you read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which I would highly recommend, one of the things you find is that if you were arrested by the KGB, by the secret police in the Soviet Union, and you were hauled off to like a tribunal, before a judge, they wanted you to admit that you were guilty. You had to. Like, they torture you until you confessed, or you could just confess. And that, I always found that so mysterious. It's like they kick down your door. They know perfectly well that they haven't got any more on you than they've got on anyone else, and yet you have to go through the damn trial, and you have to admit that they're right. It's like, why do they even bother with that? Why don't they just throw your sorry ass into the camp, which is essentially what's going to happen anyways? Why do they need your collaboration? You know, I've never quite figured that out. I think it's partly because they're not willing to let you stand in opposition to the rules, because the mere fact that you'll do that means that you exist as something that is allowed to exist outside the rules, and they're not having any of that. So that's part of it. But there's more to it. There's more to it than that. It's like the drama of collaboration. So one of the things I learned about societies like the Soviet Union, and this is true of all tyrannical societies, is that the idea that that's top down and that people are just following orders, they're good people but they're just following orders, it's like, you can forget about that. That's a stupid theory. When a society becomes tyrannical like that, the tyranny exists at every single level of the society. You tyrannize your own conscience. So let's say you're a true believer. You're a true believer in Marxist utopia, let's say, or National Socialist Third Reich that's going to last 1,000 years and be racially pure. You really believe that. And that's supposed to be a perfect state. And that's already been delivered to you. And so what that means is that insofar as you're a true believer, your own suffering becomes heretical. Because to the degree that you're suffering, you're living proof of the fact that the system is not delivering what it promised to deliver. And so you have to suppress that. You have to become your own tyrant. You can't admit that anything's gone wrong. And of course you can't talk about it to your family, because 1 out of 3 of them are government informers, just like 1 out of 3 of everyone. And you're certainly not going to mention it in the workplace, because unless you're a devout Communist Party member, you're not going anywhere. And if any of your ancestors were like landowners or bourgeoisie, it's like, you're done. You're done. Class guilt, man. You're not going anywhere. And then every single level of the bureaucracy is exactly the same as that, and on the top there's a tyrant. But the tyrant is everywhere, everywhere, from the peak to the soul. It's all tyranny. And everyone participates in that by lying about everything. And that's why you see what happens next in the movie. So Pinocchio's in jail, and he's there because he was naive and he allowed himself to be enticed, and because he did something that would have run contrary to his conscience. But the movie doesn't put up straw men, you know. The poor damn puppet got tangled into this. His conscience wasn't even around. So you have to have some sympathy for him, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because he ends up in jail and he can't get out, and the fact that it in some ways wasn't his fault doesn't change the fact that he's in jail and he can't get out. And then I was watching Louis C.K. the other night, and he was talking about children lying. He was talking about his 9-year-old daughter lying, and he said, well, it's no wonder your children lie, and it's no wonder it's impossible for you to stop them, because, you know, you're talking to someone his head would scrape the roof. They weigh like 3 times as much as you, and they're capable of force, and they're intimidating. And they say to you something like, did you take that last cookie after I told you not to? And you're thinking, oh no, I took the cookie. What am I going to do? And then you get a genius idea in your head, which smarter children learn to lie earlier. Children with high IQs learn to lie younger. And CK says, well, it's like you've just been handed a magic get out of jail free card. You can just say, no, I didn't take that cookie. And worse than that, it works in every single situation if you get away with it. And now you're supposed to learn not to do that. I said, well, great. That's the thing about comedians, you know, they'll tell you the underlying truth, which is why people think they're so funny, like the jester in a king's court, right? He's the only one who's allowed to tell the king the truth because he's beneath contempt. That's what comedians do. And so, well, so what happens is, well, Pinocchio's not very happy about this, right? It's really breaking him up. And the blue fairy appears again from the star, same way. So what this means is, and I think this is right, this is something Jung talked about, and it was also extraordinarily brilliant. He said that it's one thing to break a rule when you don't really know the rule. You can, for whatever reason, you seem to get a bit of a free pass for that. But if then you know the rule, and then you break it anyways, you get hit a lot harder. So anyways, Pinocchio's in there, and he's partly at fault, at least because he's naive, and he's very desperate about it. But it's also because his conscience isn't functioning very well. So he has his reasons, and so whatever, the blue fairy shows up again. Mother Nature steps in to aid him. And so, and that is true, I would say, because it's not like you get walloped or killed every time you make a mistake, right? It's kind of interesting. And especially that's the case with kids, is like we have more leeway for them. So the blue fairy shows up, so that's nature. So what I'm saying is that nature will cut kids a break. If you think of nature in the guise of, well, their mother, for example, but even the biology of other people. Because we're wired to accept behavior from children that we wouldn't accept from other people. So nature will forgive. So she shows up in her heavenly guise and says, what's going on? And Pinocchio, again because he's naive, but also because he's not good. He's not evil either. He's neither or both. It depends on how you look at it. And he also has no idea how smart he is and how smart he isn't, or how smart the person he's talking to is. And instead of admitting what he's done, he lies about it. And that's interesting because it does suggest that he understands at some level that he set himself up for this. Because, you know, he could have just told the truth. This horrible fox kidnapped me and sold me to this slaveholder, which is true. It's a lot more true than the story he tells. He tells a story about some monster, you know, a fictional monster. He could have told even 3/4 of the truth and had it work, but he doesn't. He just obscures the story entirely. And this is the part of the movie that people remember. And I'd edited this out for years when I was talking about this movie. I forgot why it was so significant. His nose grows, right? And it grows to ridiculous length. And why is that? I think it was Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, I think, who said, one of the advantages to telling the truth is that you don't have to remember what you said. And that, God, that's worth listening to, because so there's a bunch of things I've learned as a clinician. And one of them is, because you're often in really weird situations with people if you're a clinician, because things happen that don't happen normally, and you don't know what to do. And so what I've learned is I just say what's happening, whatever it is, regardless of what it is. You know, I'll just try to describe it as accurately as I can and not worry about, in some sense, not worry about the consequences. You know, like I'm not going out of my way to cause trouble, but so it's one thing to really know if you're ever in a really bad situation and you don't know what to do. You tell the truth minimally. You don't disclose too much. That's just another lie. You tell the truth minimally and carefully and hopefully. And you might get out of it. You might get out of it. But if you falsify it, look the hell out. So the truth is a real mechanism of protection in dangerous situations. You know, so if someone's trying to intimidate you and you think they might get violent and they ask you if you're afraid, then you tell them that you're terrified and that you hope that things will go okay. Or you say, I'll give you an example. One time I was in an airport and we were in this lineup to fly back to Canada that said international flights. And so it was a long lineup, like 50 people, and I got about 3 from the front. There were still like 40 people behind me, and the guy behind the counter decided that he was just going to shut down the line and that we could all go to this other line, which was like 300 people long. And I suggested that he not do that because we'd been standing there for half an hour, and that he could just deal with the 20 of us that were left and like have a clue. And so he called the sheriff right away. And this was down in Florida, and it wasn't that long after 9/11. And so these guys came up and they were armed. And they came and said, looked at me, because of course he'd told them that I was causing trouble, which I wasn't. I was just trying to not let, what would you say, an arrogant bureaucratic scum rat take advantage of me. So, which is not the same as causing trouble. So anyways, as soon as the cops came up, I said, look, I'm going to do exactly what you tell me to do right now, and I'm not going to cause any trouble. But I would like you to hear what actually happened. And so that's a good example of a situation like that. It's like, if someone's got you, no bravado. It's a very bad idea. And I was going to do exactly what they told me, because, you know, they didn't know who I was, and I didn't know what they had been told. So anyhow, the problem with lying is that it's a hydra. And kids find this out very early, because you tell one lie, and what happens is it has one of the consequences that you expect. Maybe you get away with it, but it has 3 or 4 others that you don't expect. And so it's like it grows some complexity. And then you have to tack a lie on each of those little complexity outcrops, and then they grow 3 more complexities, and soon this little lie turns into a great big ball of lies, and at some point it becomes painfully evident to everyone. And by that time, you're in such, you see this with politicians, like that guy who was sexting. Anthony Weiner, yeah, perfect name for him, man. It's so funny. I shouldn't make that comment because it's so obvious, but it's still funny. But, you know, that's exactly what happened to him. It's like, it wasn't even so much the event, because, you know, people are stupid, they make mistakes, and actually the public is somewhat forgiving if you say, yeah, geez, I'm a real moron, and, you know, like, really, seriously, how could I do that? But I did, and like, I'll try not to do it again. But what happens with politicians is, and I'm not speaking specifically of politicians, is they'll make an error and it gets exposed, and then they make 3 others trying to cover it up. It happened with Nixon, for example, and then the whole thing just turns into a complete scandal. And maybe they could have got out of it at the beginning by just telling the truth. It's like, yes, I'm an idiot, you know, I'll try not to do it again. Well, that isn't what happens in this case, and Pinocchio grows this elaborate series of lies, and the fairy is willing to be a little generous to him because he's little and cute and he's still a puppet, and she tells him not to do that, and that she's going to give him a pass this time, but that she isn't going to be able to intervene on his behalf again. Okay, so now Pinocchio's gone free, he's been united with his conscience, he's learned a couple of lessons. Don't be an actor, and don't lie. And those things are quite similar, right? And especially once you're caught in your actor trap, don't lie to get out, because that will just make it worse. So that's the first of his trials, his moral trials on the road to becoming real. All right, now here we're in a different place. We're at this, I think it's called the Red Lobster Inn, and it's a shadowy place, right? And it's kind of cave-like, so it's like it's an underground entrance to somewhere that's not good. And so, and it's a foggy night, and you can't really see, so everything's murky and gloomy there. And so inside, we see the coachman and the fox and the cat. And the coachman The coachman's a bad guy. He's that mask that we saw first of all. He's the archetype of that mask that was judgmental about Pinocchio having a voice. And it's like, one of the things Jung said about the shadow, and this is, I would say, one of the primary impediments to enlightenment, is that if you start looking at your motives for misbehaving, and I mean by that something very specific. I don't mean that you're misbehaving by someone else's standards. I don't mean that. I mean, when you know by your own standards that you're doing something that's devious or malevolent or underhanded, you know it, and you still do it. So it's your own judgment you're bringing to bear on yourself. If you look at why you're doing that, the longer you look at it, the deeper a hole you dig. Well, so you look at the coachman here, kind of looks like a demented Santa Claus, you know. Doesn't have a beard, but it's a nice touch on the animator's part. He's even got the pipe and the red suit. And so he's listening to the fox and the cat brag about how much money they made selling Pinocchio to the puppet master and how evil and terrible they are, and they're bragging away, and he's the real thing, eh? He's the real thing. And he can see through their little petty, narcissistic, grandiose tales of quasi-criminality and has nothing but contempt for it. And you can see that in his facial expressions, like he's sitting back a bit thinking, keep talking, bucko, pretty soon I'm going to have you right where I want you. And so the fox and the cat are drinking beer and smoking cigarettes and talking about how evil they are, and bragging about how they got one over on the, like a 4-year-old, real impressive guys, real impressive. And the coachman is thinking up his own nefarious schemes right now for what he might do with that puppet if he got his hands on him. And so that's when he reveals himself, right? So what you see, the filmmakers just do it for a second, and that's an archetypal trip. It's like, you've got the fox and the cat, they're sort of petty examples of criminality and evil. And then you've got the coachman, and he's the real thing, but he's not really shown anybody who he is. And then at one scene in the bar, he lets his guard down and he lets them see what he's really like. And so you see this all teeth and predatory eyes and glee all at the same time, right? That's a bad combination. I'm going to eat you, and it's going to make me very happy. That's insanity. You do not want to see that look on someone's face. And so that's the look. And the fox is traumatized by that. He just, like, he thinks he's a bad guy. And he's not. He just can't be a good guy. He hasn't got the talent to be a bad guy. So, and then he's talking to the coachman and bragging, and the coachman's had enough of it and shows his real face. And it's like, that's not good. The fox gets a real glimpse into hell, and that just terrifies him. Like he's, and then the coachman, the other thing the coachman does is reveal his plans. And his plans are to kidnap Pinocchio along with a bunch of other boys and to take them to this place called Pleasure Island. And the fox knows what's going on there. And so it's the foreshadowing of the next stage of the adventure. And so after the fox and the cat are terrified, the coachman, who takes you along with him, has a little chat with them, and they describe exactly what they're going to do next. And the fox and the cat know perfectly well that they're over their head, but at this point in their misadventures, there's no pulling back. Okay.
When you said that the guy was smiling at the thing was predatory glee, and which is insanity. How do you define insanity in this context?
Well, let's call it what you don't want to encounter alone in an alley at midnight, and leave it at that.
I mean,
But that is what I mean in this context. That's exactly what I mean. And then not only is the person there waiting for you, but they're looking forward to whatever might happen.
Yeah, for sure. I just mean like in a psychological context, using that word "saying" has like its own connotations. So I was making sure I wasn't interpreting it in the wrong way.
No, well, the movie provides the frame for the interpretation in this particular situation. And so he's the thing that hauls naive young boys off to their doom. Okay, so that's... So I hope we can... My plan is to finish this today. So, and then we'll go into the more concrete details now that you've got some sense of the way that a narrative like this can unfold. So if you remember, we were just leaving this terrible little bar, which I think was called the Red Lobster or something like that, where the fox and the cat had met the coachman. And the coachman is obviously someone who takes you somewhere. He takes you on a trip. And the coachman basically revealed himself. First, he kind of looks like I guess, a somewhat jolly old man, although his expression doesn't precisely read as jolly. And then he reveals himself as something positively satanic. And that's enough to terrify these two-bit thugs, the fox and the cat, who think they're tough but really aren't tough at all. And so they see at some point what they're really tangled up in. And I think I mentioned to you that that was something akin. Jung had this idea that people's shadows reach all the way down to hell, which is actually a very frightening concept. And what he meant by that is that if you take a look at the impulses that drive you that are actually malevolent, if you can admit to such impulses, that if you basically follow those all the way down to their origin, you find some very nasty things. And what you find down there basically is what allies you with people who've done terrible things. And that's not a very pleasant experience, I would say, although one thing that's worth thinking about is that it is something that can protect you against being very, very badly hurt. Because one of the things that characterizes people who develop post-traumatic stress disorder is that they're often naive. And then they encounter something that's really not within their framework of thinking, and it's usually something bad. And because there isn't anything in their philosophy, their way of looking at the world that has prepared them for that, they end up fragmented and devastated. And so it's actually protective to you if you can figure out what your full range of capabilities is, because that can help you understand other people a lot better and to be wiser and more careful in your actions. It's also useful, I think, if you want to convince yourself to act properly, because if you regard yourself as harmless, which is a big mistake, then nothing you can do is really that bad, right? Because you're harmless after all. But if you understand that you're seriously not harmless, then that can make you a lot more careful with yourself. And I would say that's especially true maybe when you have kids and you start dealing with your kids. If you know that what you're capable of because you're human, then that can motivate you to be much more careful with what you say and do. And I don't mean cautious, I don't mean timid, I don't mean any of that. Anyways, the coachman's got these guys in his grasp now, regardless, and partly because they're already down this road and they can't back off, and partly because he also offers them more money than they've seen before. And so, as bad as they are, they're going to get worse. Anyways, Pinocchio has now decided, after his latest misadventure, to return to the proper pathway. He's off to school again. And he's still pretty naive, although perhaps not as much so as he was before. And so he decides that he's going to do things right. He's going to go get educated. He's going back to school. He's going to take the conventional route to discipline and be a good boy, roughly speaking. And so he's off to school. And the fox waylays him again. This is a really interesting scene. It took me quite a long time to unpack this too. And so the fox, first of all, starts out by acting like he's sympathetic towards Pinocchio. And so he's empathetic, you could say. And so this is an interesting analysis of empathy. So what happens is the fox convinces Pinocchio through a variety of maneuvers that he's actually not feeling very well, that he's sick. He really convinces him that he's a victim. And one of the things, I had a graduate student named Maja Djikic who had worked with the UN in Bosnia, and she had toured some of the mass grave sites there. And we wrote a paper one time called "You Can Neither Remember Nor Forget What You Don't Understand." And it was a paper about the idea, for example, it was partly about the idea that we should never forget the Holocaust, and that the idea there is that, well, we should never forget it and we shouldn't repeat it. But the thing is, if you don't understand how those things come about, you can't really remember them, right? You think about them as a set of historical facts, but that's not the kind of remembering that actually makes any difference. You have to understand the causal pathways. You have to understand how a society would transform in that manner, and more importantly, you have to understand the role of the individuals within that society, unless you're going to assume that they're so completely unlike you that there's no connection whatsoever, in which case you haven't remembered it at all. You haven't learned anything at all, because the right lesson from what happened in the 20th century is this is what human beings are like. That's the correct lesson. And you can say, well, not me, but you should, but probably you too. That's the thing, probably. And probably me too, at least under normal circumstances. Anyways, the fox convinces Pinocchio that he's sick. He performs a lot of tricks to do this. Now, you could say that Pinocchio is susceptible to this because maybe there's still part of him that's looking for the easy way out. And so, one of the things that Maya and I found when we were writing this paper, we were looking at the discourse that precedes genocide in genocidal states. And the enhancement of a sense of victimization on the part of one of the groups, usually the group that's going to commit the genocide. First of all, their sense of being victims is much heightened by the demagogues who are trying to stir up this sort of hatred. So they basically say, look, you've been oppressed in a variety of ways, and these are the people who did it, and they're not going to stop doing it, and this time we're going to get them before they get us. It's something like that. And so there's something very pathological about the enhancement of victimization, which is, well, see, that the problem as far as I'm concerned with it is it's not thought through very well. Because there's a point that's being made, and the point is that people have been oppressed and they suffer. And that's true, that point. But then the proper framework from within which to interpret that, I believe, is that that's characteristic of life. You can't take it personally in some sense. And you can't divide the world neatly into perpetrators and victims. And you certainly can't divide the world neatly into perpetrators and victims and then assume that you're only in the victim class and then assume that that gives you certain, like access to certain forms of redress, let's say. It gets dangerous very rapidly if you do that sort of thing. So, for example, one of the things that characterized the Soviet Union, and this was particularly true in the 1920s, but afterwards, so the Soviets were very much enamored of the idea of class guilt. So, for example, although it was only about 40 years previously that the serfs had been emancipated, they weren't much more than slaves, right? And so that was the bulk of the Russian population. They were bought and sold along with the land. So they had been emancipated, and some of them, many of them had turned into independent farmers, and some of them had become reasonably prosperous because, at least in principle, I presume a certain proportion of them from being crooked, but I presume a larger proportion from actually being able to raise food. And of course, at that time, the bulk of the Russian food population was produced by these relatively successful peasant farmers. And relatively successful would mean maybe they had a brick house or something, and maybe they had a couple of cows, and maybe they were able to hire a few people. And so, you know, it wasn't like they were massive landowners or anything. But I've talked to you a little bit about the Pareto principle and the notion that in any domain of activity, a small proportion of people end up producing most of what's in that domain of activity. The same was true in Russia with regards to these peasant farmers. Some of them were extraordinarily efficient, and they produced most of Russia's food. When the communists came in, they described those landholders as parasites, essentially, predicated on the Marxist idea that if someone had extracted profit from an enterprise, that they had basically stolen that profit from the people, say, that they had employed or otherwise oppressed. And so you could be a member of the kulak, K-U-L-A-K, K-U-L-A-K. You could be a member of the kulak class. And then because you were a member of that class, you were automatically guilty. And so what happened was, and you got to think this through to really understand what happened. So what happened was the intellectual communists were sent out in cadres out into these little towns to find people who would help them round up the kulaks. Now you got to think about what a small town is like, because so imagine you're in a town and there's 3 or 4 people or maybe 10 people or something like that who are a little more successful than everyone else. And a certain number of people are going to be fine with that and maybe even happy about it because they regard those people as particularly productive and, you know, as stalwart members of the community, regardless of their flaws. But there's going to be some people who are not happy about it at all, that are going to be very resentful about that and jealous. And so those are going to be people whose characters, I would say, are of the less positive type. And so when the intellectuals came in and described the reason that these people should be treated as parasites and profiteers, then it was the resentful minority in those towns, and that would be the kind of guy that hangs around in the bar all the time and is completely unconscientious and fails at everything and then blames everyone else for it. The intellectuals came in and said, this is unfair that this happened to you. You've actually been victimized, and now it's your opportunity to go have your revenge. And so that's exactly what happened. Now, in some of the villages, sometimes the peasants would actually surround the farmsteads of these more successful people and try to defend them, but that never worked out for very long. And so then these angry mobs would go into the farmhouses and strip the place right down to nothing. And they packed these people up and sent them on trains with no food out to Siberia, where there was no place to live. And so that they were packed into houses, you know, maybe they had a square meter each to live in, and all their children died of typhoid, and many of them froze to death. Many people died. Millions of people died as a consequence of the dekulakization, at least as a consequence of its total effect. So what happened then was that there wasn't any food produced. And so then 6 million Ukrainians starved to death in the 1920s, which is something you never hear about, right? You never hear about that. Why do you never hear about that? That's a question worth asking. You know, it was an absolute catastrophe. So these people were starving, right to the point of cannibalism, right? I mean, it was ugly as anything you could possibly imagine. If you were a mother and so you're supposed to hand all your grain into the central committee, mostly for distribution into the cities. You didn't get to keep any for yourself. And so maybe then afterwards, if you were a mother, you'd go out in the fields that had already been harvested, and you'd pick up individual grains of wheat. And if you didn't turn those in, that was death for you. So that's how far it was pushed. So that's a little story about how the idea of victimization and perpetration can get out of hand extraordinarily rapidly. And so whenever people are beating the victim drum, you know, they'll cover that up with empathy, roughly speaking. We're speaking on behalf of the oppressed. It's like, maybe you are, but maybe you're no saint because, you know, you're so sure that you're a saint and you're only speaking from the position of good. It's highly unlikely. Anyway, so Pinocchio is enticed into believing that he's a victim. Now, the logical part of that is that it is the case that, you know, you can make a very strong case that every human being is in some sense involved in a tragic enterprise, right? Because you're biologically vulnerable. You're not what you could be as a biological specimen, right? You're full of imperfections, and plus you're going to be sick, and those you love are going to be sick, and everything ends up in death. And so that there's a very tragic element to that. And then by the same token, you're also subject to the tyrannical aspect of your culture, right? Because it's forcing you to be a certain way all the time. Socialization does that. You're required to modify your own intrinsic nature in order to come into conformity with the broader community. And you can think about that from the Piagetian sense, which is the socialization makes you a more and more sophisticated person. And there's some truth in that. But you can also be subject just to tyranny, you know. And I see people in my practice, for example, who've had very tyrannical fathers, for example. Sometimes they have tyrannical mothers as well. But they're not so much encouraged to integrate properly into the social community as they are harassed and abused and made to feel insufficient and, you know, basically subject to tyranny. And so it's quite, and that's true of everyone to some degree. You know, you come to university and there's a tyrannical aspect to it. Especially in a big institution like this, you're not really marked out as an individual in any sense. You know, you're a number along with 60,000 other people, and you know there's something cold and impersonal about that, which is well represented in the design of this classroom, say. But by the same token, you know, the university provides you with an identity, while you're exploring an intellectual landscape. You know, you have a lot of freedom compared to the vast majority of people. Perhaps you don't have as much freedom as you might if you compared it to some utopian notion of freedom, but in any real world sense, you're unbelievably well protected by the university, partly because it stamps you with the identity student, which is a respectable identity, and so you can go off and educate yourself as much as you can. Well, and everyone in society says that's okay. They carve out a protected space for you. So at the same time as you're being tyrannized by the institution and forced in some ways also to adopt the viewpoints, say, of the professors, depending on the professor, you're also the beneficiary of that, just like you're the beneficiary of this huge industrial infrastructure that underlies everything we do. So anyways, the fact that your life is tragic necessarily, and that you are subject to oppression, makes the victimization story really easy to swallow. But then there's the dark side of that too. And this is actually what happens with Pinocchio. So what happens here is that he's told that he's ill and convinced that he's ill. And they do use trickery. And so again, you could look at him in some sense as an innocent victim. But the innocence, the filmmakers do a good job of hedging against the innocent interpretation, because what he's offered and accepts because he's ill is an easy way out. And so what the fox basically tells him is that he needs to have a vacation because he's sick, and he can go off to Pleasure Island, which is this place of impulsivity, roughly speaking, and whim. It's like reversion to being 2 years old in some sense, and that he really needs that because otherwise he's not going to be able to live properly. He's not going to be able to recover his health. And so what Pinocchio is offered is the opportunity to abandon responsibility as a reward for adopting the guise of victim. And that's really worth thinking about, because one of the things I've thought about for a long time is that I've been trying to figure out what gives people's lives meaning. And tragedy gives life its negative meaning. And nobody disputes that. Even if you're nihilistic, you're not going to dispute the fact that tragedy gives life negative meaning. So when nihilists say that life is meaningless, that isn't exactly what they mean. They mean that life is suffering, but there isn't anything transcendent about it that you could set against that suffering. That's nihilism. It's not that life is meaningless. That would just be neutral. It's like no one believes that, and they certainly don't act like they believe it. If you look at it technically, and we will as we progress through this class, that in order to have any positive meaning in your life, you have to have identified a goal, and you have to be working towards it. And there is a technical reason for that. And the technical reason, as far as I can tell, is that the circuitry that produces the kind of positive emotion that people really like is only activated when you notice that when you're proceeding towards a goal that you value. And so that means that if you don't have a goal that you value, you can't have any positive emotion. So anyways, Pinocchio is transformed into a victim, and he's offered this identity. And he takes it. Now, it's partly because he's deceived and manipulated, but it's also partly because the fox offers him the abandonment of responsibility as payment for adopting the victim identity. So this is where his own lack of morality, let's say, because this is all about Pinocchio's development as a character, plays a role in his demise. So if I'm a victim, then everyone else owes me something, and I don't have to take any responsibility. And so the pathological pathway that they offer Pinocchio is not the worst of the pathological pathways. But here, at least as far as the imagination, the collective imagination that created this movie is concerned, this is where you get to the most pathological form of, let's call it temptation. And that's the temptation to abandon responsibility and to engage in impulsive pleasure seeking. Short-term pleasure seeking. So here's the fox pretending to be a doctor investigating Pinocchio's illness, and he makes some notes, which is all just meaningless scribble, right? It's like white noise, and it doesn't matter that the arguments that he's making are completely incoherent, and it doesn't matter that he actually doesn't know anything. What he's selling is easy to buy, and so Pinocchio buys it. And by the end of the conversation with the fox, he's pretty convinced that he's useless and that he needs a vacation. You know, this is an Oedipal situation as well, which I touched on in the other lecture. I mean, let's imagine that you have a child that is a little on the neurotic side, so high negative emotion, and maybe one that's also a little bit on the sickly side, so has a variety of, let's say, relatively minor ailments, but ailments nonetheless. And so what that means as a parent, we'll say mother for this example because I want to use the Oedipal example, you have to make a decision all the time about exactly how you're going to treat that child. One decision is, well, you don't have to go to school today because you're not feeling well. It's like, fair enough. But do you make the same decision the next day? And do you make the same decision the next day? And let's imagine that you enable the child to avoid responsibility as a consequence of capitalizing on their illness. Well, then that's not going to be very good for the child. The rule with a sickly child has to be something like, I'm going to push you right to your limit. Because otherwise, how is the person going to figure out what they can do? And if they can't figure out what they can do, then they're not going to be able to make their way in the world at all. And then that gets muddied very badly if you're not exactly sure that you want them to make their way in the world. You know, maybe you're just as happy because you'd be sitting at home alone if your child was there with you. And maybe you'd be just as happy at some level if they never grew up at all, because then they won't leave. And maybe that's because you have a terrible marriage and you're lonesome, you know. Maybe it's an abusive marriage and your husband has chased away all your friends. And so you don't have anything at all. And maybe that's because you didn't stand up for yourself very well, apart from the fact that he was, you know, tyrannical in his central nature. And so then all those little warps and bends in your psyche are going to manifest themselves right in the background of every single one of those decisions. My daughter had a lot of illnesses when she was adolescent, and they were very serious, and it was very difficult to figure out what to do about that because you couldn't exactly apply normative rules, right? And we always had to figure out if she was communicating her symptoms to us, how seriously to take those. And the answer was the least amount of serious possible. It's something like that, because we needed to know and she needed to know what she could do in spite of the fact that she had problems. And one of the things I really tried to instill in her, and I think it worked, is that you don't ever want to use your illness as an excuse for not doing anything. Not consciously. You know, sometimes you might not know, I'm not feeling well, what can I do? Well, you don't know, right? Because sometimes when you're not feeling well, you can do more than you think, and sometimes you can do less than you think. It's not like it's obvious, but sometimes it's obvious, you know, this little temptation flits through your mind and you think, well, I don't really want to do what I'm doing today and I'm not feeling very well, so I don't have to do it. You do that 100 times, then you don't know how sick you are anymore. And then you're in real trouble, because not only are you sick, but you've muddied the waters. And so you have both problems then, is you're actually ill and you've betrayed yourself by using that as an excuse not to pursue your responsibilities. And that, I think, if you do both of those things happen to you at the same time, you're in real trouble. And it's really hard not to have that happen. So anyways, Pinocchio gets enticed into believing that he's a victim. The fact that he's insufficient is used as an excuse by the fox and the cat to offer him a trip to Pleasure Island. And this is, I think, where the movie gets particularly dark. And so off they go, singing away. They have to carry him. So you could say, in some sense, he's carried by societal pathology and his own trouble. He's carried like a puppet off to Pleasure Island. And so the cricket is again left behind. He's not the world's best conscience at this point. So Pinocchio goes off to meet the coachman, and the coachman has already said he's collecting bad little boys. And he's got them all in the coach. They're all delinquent types here. And the ticket on the coach was the Ace of Spades, which is what Pinocchio is holding. And he's with this character here called Lampwick. And that's an interesting name. So he's the thing that burns in the middle of a light, Lampwick. And that's interesting because it's a play on Lucifer. because Lucifer means bringer of light. And so Lampwick is a play on that. And Lampwick is really a nasty piece of work. He's got this false arrogance about him. He's got this like cynical voice, really deeply cynical voice. And he's only, I don't know how old he's supposed to be in this, maybe 12 or something like that, or 13. And so he's one of those kids who's become prematurely cynical. I'll tell you a story about that. So I used to live in Montreal. I lived in a poor neighborhood. And one day I was out in the back alley building a fence because I was putting a little fence around my little tiny backyard. And there was a house across the alley down the street a ways where there was a lot of like not good partying. A lot of bikers were hanging around there. And I knew there was a little kid that lived there as well. Anyways, I was out there in the back alley pounding away on my fence, and these little kids came up, and they were little. They were like 3 and 4 years old, hey? And they spoke Joual, right, kind of really heavily accented Quebecois French, and so my French isn't good, so I could hardly understand them. But they were watching me hammer, and they got a little closer, and they had one kid who was clearly the leader, had a real scowl on his face, hey? And so they were watching, and I kind of motioned to one of them that they could use the hammer. And that kid said, and I'm going to mangle this, but he said, "Je volais," or something like that. And what it meant is, "I'll steal that." And so I thought, and then he came over and he tugged on it, and he wanted me to take it. And he was quite angry, and, well, I wasn't going to let him take it. And then so I couldn't engage him. I couldn't get him to play, and his buddies were sort of hanging around behind him, and they wouldn't come and play because he wouldn't. And so he was hostile right away to me. And then, so the fence piece was laying out in the alley, and these little monsters started running across it, which I thought was really remarkable, but it was terrible at the same time because they were really little kids. That shouldn't be happening when you're like 3 or 4. If that's happening at that age, things are not good. And so that kid was already like seriously not happy with the world. And I'd been studying antisocial behavior for a long time by that point, and I knew that the kids who are destined to jail later in their lives are kids who are rough and tough when they're 2 years old, but then don't get socialized. Or maybe worse, they get anti-socialized, which is exactly what happened to this kid. He'd obviously been ignored and abused. Certainly no one had ever played with him in any real way because he wouldn't play. And it's not good if a kid is that little and you can't get them to play. Something's gone seriously wrong because they're so playful at that age that it's like 90% of them. Anyway, so they were running back and forth on this fence. I thought, stomping on it, and I was right there. I thought, well, first of all, I thought that was remarkable, but I also thought it was absolutely horrifying because, in some sense I could see where this kid was headed and why at that early stage in his life. It's not a pleasant thing to behold, but there was nothing that could be done about it. And that's kind of what this Lampwick is like. He's prematurely cynical. This kid was already cynical and he was like 4 years old. Most kids don't get cynical till they're teenagers, and then often they don't get completely cynical, and usually they more or less grow out of it. But it had happened to him much earlier. So this Lampwick character, he's already decided that he knows everything, that everyone else's opinion is worth nothing, and that there's nothing in culture or society that holds any utility whatsoever for someone like him. Now you can imagine developing that way if you were raised in a family where people were generally lying to you, and that they randomly treated you or neglected you, and that you couldn't discern anything about them that was admirable or positive. Of course you'd assume that the whole structure is corrupt and that you had to take care of yourself and no one else. Well, not of course. Not everyone assumes that under those situations. I shouldn't say of course. But it's a logical set of conclusions. So, and of course it's proportionate to some degree to how much abuse you take. Although there are lots of stories of people who've been terribly abused as children who grew up to be, kind, remarkable, responsible, thoughtful people who were absolutely opposed to abuse instead of propagating it. There's no direct causal pathway. Anyways, Lampwick is pretty happy to be on this coachway to Pleasure Island, which he's heard about. He said, well, it's all you can eat, it's all you can smoke, you don't have to do any work, and you can do anything you want. So you might say, well, it's too good to be true. like the gingerbread house in the Hansel and Gretel story, right? The kids are lost, there's a gingerbread house. It's a house, which is something they need, and it's made out of cookies. It looks like it's a little bit too good to be true. And of course, in the house, there's the negative part of that, which is the old witch who wants to eat children. And that's a story about what happens to people if they're offered more than they should be offered. So, anyways, Lampwick is firing off, he has a little slingshot, and he's firing off pebbles at the horses who are pulling the carriage, and that's just kind of the guy that he is. So he takes Pinocchio under his wing, and the cricket is down there in the dust. He's caught back up to the carriage, but he's having a rough time at this point. And this is also a story to some degree about the transition into adolescence, you know, because adolescence is a time people are still pretty impulsive, and their view is quite short term, and they're more likely to pursue immediate pleasures and all of that, and that can get really out of hand. So anyways, they separate from the mainland and go on a boat, and so they're off to Pleasure Island, dark place. And the coachman opens the gates and lets the delinquents into Pleasure Island, and they basically have a riot. And this is Pleasure Island here. It's full of amusement park rides. And you know, one of the things that's kind of interesting about horror movies, I'm sure you've noticed this, is that they're often set in amusement parks. And clowns are often characters of horror. We'll leave the clowns aside for now, but the amusement park thing, that's pretty interesting. It's like, why in the world would an amusement park be a place of horror? And the first question might be, well, have you ever been to an amusement park? Because there is something about them that's really, they have a dark side, a clear dark side. And part of it is that people with nothing better to do are spending money stupidly, and they're being fleeced by the people who operate the amusement park. You know, and they have, let's say, a stereotypically dark reputation, and they're moving around all the time, which is also something that psychopaths do, and all they're doing is moving from community to community and taking the money from the rubes, fundamentally. Anyways, Lampwick, who's got this very arrogant look on his face and this kind of strut, it's a bravado, that's what that's called. It's a false confidence, and it's the sort of thing that people do when they're trying to impress upon others that they're high in the dominance hierarchy, but really they're not. So it's a mimicry of dominance, but it's something that can be intimidating, there's no doubt about it. Anyways, Lampwick, who's got this very arrogant look on his face and this kind of strut, it's a bravado, that's what that's called. It's a false confidence, and it's the sort of thing that people do when they're trying to impress upon others that they're high in the dominance hierarchy, but really they're not. So it's a mimicry of dominance, but it's something that can be intimidating, there's no doubt about it. Anyways, they load up on food. Pinocchio's carrying a pie and an ice cream cone simultaneously, and then they're off to have a fight. And Lampwick says something like, it's good to punch someone in the nose sometimes, just for the, I think he says, heck of it. And so Pinocchio adopts this strut, and in they go to the rough house. And then in the next scene, you see this model home up for destruction. It's quite an interesting scene symbolically. You see, in the middle of this house here, there's a stained glass window that has a mandala on it. We'll see it more clearly in a minute. And a mandala is a sacred symbol of the self. That's the Jungian interpretation. It's a symbol. It's very difficult to describe, but it's a symbol. Music is a mandala, except it's played out across time. So you could say that thing is the same as music, but it's kind of like a slice of music. It's the same idea. You know, sometimes you see those slow motion or sped up motion videos of a flower unfolding. It's the same idea. You can imagine that being set to music, and somehow that would make sense. And the mandala is like a symbol of the unfolding of being, or the source of meaning, or something like that. And it's also a symbol of the self from the Jungian perspective. And so there you see it more clearly. The kids are starting to burn this place and to trash it, and they're dragging a grand piano down the stairs. The destruction of high culture, about which they're nothing but cynical. because they don't believe that hard work and sacrifice can produce something of any value, and they want to bring it down and destroy it. And that's partly because you can see this in the story of Cain and Abel. Abel is hardworking and everyone likes him, and he makes the proper sacrifices, and so his life goes really well. And that's part of the reason that Cain hates him, and he's jealous and resentful. But worse than that, if you're not doing very well and you're around someone who's doing very well, it's very painful, because the mere fact of their being judges you. And so it's very easy to want to destroy that ideal, so that you don't have to live with the terrible consequences of seeing it embodied in front of you. And so part of the reason that people want to tear things down is so that they don't have anything to contrast themselves against and to feel bad. And that's exactly what's happening here. The kids are destroying all of this culture, roughly speaking, because it judges them. The fact that it exists judges them. And I've often thought this about Michelangelo's statue of David, which is this heroic, so David was a shepherd, obviously, and it doesn't sound like much, but back in those times, being a shepherd was a big deal, because there were lions and you had a slingshot, and so like you got to defend your sheep from lions with a slingshot. Anyways, the statue is very heroic, and you look at that and you think, well, that's the possibility of humankind, but by the same token, it's also what you're not. And so, as well as being an ideal, it's a judge, and every ideal is a judge. So, yes?
Going back to your example of Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
So you're using that as an example to illustrate becoming bitter as a result of not being able to achieve
sure
status as a result
success
of,
even
success as a result of hard work. But in the example of Cain and Abel, like one was a shepherd and the other was a farmer, and the one who
one is, yes, that's right,
one who was the shepherd was the one who was favored.
Yes, that's right.
So was that a result of the hard work, or was that a result of
good question. The stories, well, that's a good question. Those stories are very, very complicated, and the story is very ambivalent about whether Cain is not rewarded because he makes bad sacrifices or because God's just in a bad mood. And I like that. If you read the story, I've read multiple translations of the story, and when Cain comes to God to complain, God basically tells him, look, buddy, before you go about criticizing the structure of reality, you should look to your own inadequacies. He says, sin crouches at your door like a predatory, sexually aroused animal, and you invited it in to have its way with you, and something has emerged as a consequence. So don't be bothering me about my creation before you look to yourself. So there's a very strong hint that the reason that God has not favored Cain's sacrifices is because they weren't of particularly good quality. So, but it is ambivalent in the story, and there is the shepherd versus farmer motif as well. And of course that motif runs through the entire corpus of stories to some degree, especially the shepherd motif. So it's only about a paragraph long, that whole story, and it packs all that into that tiny little amount of space. But the idea that Cain kills Abel to get rid of his ideal and also to punish God, roughly speaking, it's a brilliant story. I mean, these guys who go around shooting up high schools, or shooting up high schools in particular, but they're definitely out for revenge, and what they're revenging themselves against or to who is not exactly clear. Anyway, so these kids are just tearing down this model home, tearing down Western civilization, I suppose is another way of looking at it, or just tearing down civilization, period. And Pinocchio's having a pretty good time. He's got his axe and he's looking a little malevolent there, and happy to be destroying things, which is of course a pretty simple thing to do. So there's that image that I told you about, the mandala. That's a flower in this image. And so what happens is that I think it's Lampwick throws a brick through it. And so what that means symbolically is the self is a symbol of your potential, among very many other things. But by engaging in this sort of impulsive, destructive activity, Lampwick and Pinocchio are making it impossible for them to further their development. And they're doing that to some degree consciously. They basically say to hell with it and toss a brick through this highest ideal, the thing through which light shines. So also that harkens back to the star as well. So anyways, the coachman is paying attention to all this, and he's actually pretty happy about the fact that these boys are so involved in their stupid amusements that that they're not paying any attention to what's actually going on. And he calls these people out of the darkness, these creatures out of the darkness. So you get these black, you can hardly see them there, but they're black cloaked figures with glowing eyes, and they're shutting the door of the amusement park. And that's very interesting. It's an extraordinarily interesting. We already know that the coachman is up to no good, but now he's got these minions that are faceless in some sense. They're clearly creatures of the night, and they're up to no good. And so you have the sense that the boys are being offered bread in circuses, roughly speaking. But there's a real reason for it. There's a manipulative reason for it. They're being enticed into a trap. And the doors are closed, and these underground beings are involved in the plot. And obviously the coachman understands this perfectly well. And so one of the ways to understand this is to think about what totalitarian states have to offer their populace and what they offer them. And this happened particularly as Rome declined, let's say. That's where the term bread and circuses originally came from, is that as the situation degenerates, then people have to be offered stupid amusements more and more frequently in order for them to ignore what's actually going on in the background. And, a war can be that kind of stupid amusement. Anyways, later that night, the entire place is completely devastated, and all we see is the wreckage of everything that was there before. And again, the cricket has got separated from Pinocchio, and so he's trying to find him, and Pinocchio ends up in this bar that's shaped like an 8-ball. He's shooting pool with Lampwick, and that's just another indication of wasting his time, basically. And you can see in the forefront there's some cards for gambling, and so he's engaged in these sort of, you might say, pointless, hedonic pursuits, and he's enticing Pinocchio along the same route. And so he teaches him to smoke first. That doesn't go very well. So Pinocchio takes a huge drag on a cigar, and it just about kills him. And when Lampwick asks him how he likes it, he shakes his head and says, that it was really quite good, but he's so sick that he can hardly stand up, and he's hallucinating double balls on the pool table. And then the cricket shows up and stands on the 8-ball and kind of gives one of those declamatory speeches again, because he still hasn't quite figured out that standing up proud and spouting off the rules isn't exactly the right way for the conscience to behave. And Lampwick picks him up by the scruff of the neck, roughly speaking, and first of all asks who he is. So obviously he's divorced from his own conscience, and then makes fun of Pinocchio for paying attention to this little bug. And that's kind of a nice indication of what happens in adolescence, because of course as the children move away from their parents and into their groups, especially when the groups are misbehaving, often what happens is that the other members of the group will torture a person who isn't willing to try something dangerous or foolish by making fun of the fact that they're, too attached to their conscience. And there's a positive element to that, because you should take some risks when you're a teenager and also later in life. And so if you won't take any risks, there's actually something wrong with you. But there's a negative element in that, teenagers do all sorts of stupid things, and perhaps it's amazing that we all live through it, actually, as far as I'm concerned. And some people take extraordinary risks, and they don't make it through at all, or they end up in the permanently antisocial population, and then they're, basically career criminals. 5% of the criminals commit 95% of the crimes. It's another Pareto distribution. So, anyways, Lampwick isn't going to listen to Pinocchio or to the cricket. He laughs at him with this kind of braying laugh, which is some foreshadowing, and the cricket gets all upset, puts his coat on backwards, and ends up dumped down a pool table hole and otherwise abused. And so he stomps on out of there. He tells Pinocchio that he can take care of himself, and he stomps on out of there. And so Pinocchio is left without the guidance of conscience, and the cricket is trying to figure out how to get off Pleasure Island. But he goes through the gates and he sees what's actually going on. And what's going on is that the coachman has this like slave boat down in the bowels of the island, and he's got all these black-suited minions with the glowing eyes working for him, and they're rounding up what look like donkeys. And so they're beasts of burden, right? And so there's an idea here that if you pursue impulsive pleasure to the detriment of the development of your character, you're going to end up a beast of burden. You're going to end up a slave to a tyrant. And that's exactly right. And so anyways, the cricket doesn't, you can see one of those black-suited horrors here hauling donkeys out of this crate, and one of them has a hat on, and they look very sad, and they're in different crates, and one of them says sold to the salt mines, and one says sold to the circus, and so they're shipped off to be slaves, roughly speaking, and they look very sad. And then one of them gets hauled out of a crate, and he's still got a hat, he has a hat on and a sweater, and he can still talk. He's a boy, it turns out, that's been half transformed into a jackass, a braying jackass, prior to being enslaved. And so that's another thing that's quite interesting about the story. You know, it also makes the case that if you replace your voice with stupid braying, that the probability that you're going to become enslaved by a tyrant is extraordinarily high. And anyways, this kid is still a little bit human. He starts to cry for his mom, and the coachman basically throws him back into the crate and says that he's not ready yet. And the reason for that is that he still had the power of independent speech. You remember, right at the beginning of the movie, when the mouth was painted on Pinocchio, we saw that mask that was really glaring at the process. And I said that character recurs continually throughout the movie, and this is a good example of that, because the coachman is the enemy of anything that has its own voice. So he's the anti-Geppetto, that's a good way of thinking about it. He's the tyrannical aspect of the culture. But insofar as one of these mostly donkeys, mostly jackasses can still talk, then they're not completely fit for slavery. And you remember this movie was also being made at about the same time that the Nazi transformation of Germany was taking place. And so all these terrible underground things, you know, this process whereby people were being reduced to ideological slaves, say, and in this terrible process that was all playing out in Europe in a very big way. And it's not like people weren't aware of that, you know, it was in the air. So anyways, the donkeys, the jackasses that can still talk, are crying and complaining and repenting, and the coachman turns into a full tyrant again and cracks a whip, if I remember correctly, and says, you've had your fun and now you're going to pay for it. So the cricket gets word of all this, he gets wind of it, he starts to understand what's happened, is that all these bad kids were enticed out onto this island so that they could be enslaved. And he's really taken aback by that, to say the least, but he realizes what's going on, so he runs back to find Pinocchio. And then the scene switches back to the 8-ball bar where Lampwick is drinking beer and complaining about what the conscience said. You know, because he's kind of guilty and ashamed, but he won't admit it, because he doesn't admit anything. He knows everything. He's not going to admit anything about himself that isn't perfect. He's a real totalitarian in training. And he drinks this beer and he's laughing about the conscience and putting him down. And then he says, well, what does he say exactly? What does he think I am, a jackass or something like that? Maybe that's not the words exactly. And then he grows these ears. And Pinocchio sees that and immediately takes a look at the beer and stops drinking it. And then Lampwick transforms one more time and his face turns into the face of a donkey. And he's laughing still. And then his hands, oh yes, he laughs and he starts to bray like a jackass. And he's horrified by that. And then Pinocchio laughs and the braying comes out as well. And so now they're absolutely horrified. And Lampwick actually figures out what's going on. He figures out that he's been tricked and that he's transforming, and he's completely horrified by it. He becomes conscious of what's happening to him. And there's one particularly, I would say, dramatic scene where his hands have transformed into hooves and he's kicking and leaping around the room in panic, and he comes up to a mirror and sees himself as a jackass, and then he turns around and breaks the mirror. And so, you know, he's self-conscious for a moment, then he destroys his capacity for self-consciousness, then he transforms entirely into a jackass. He's farther down the road than Pinocchio, and he comes crawling to Pinocchio to save him and asks that the conscience comes back so that he can get out of this, but of course it's a bit too late. And so then Pinocchio grows jackass ears, and he's absolutely terrified by it as well. He knows what's coming. And the cricket comes back and guides him off Pleasure Island. And so then they end up on a cliff, because this is an island after all, and they have to jump into the unknown, right? Out of this impulsive, adolescent, hedonic playground into the unknown. And that's how they escape. So that's the first time that Pinocchio has to leave. This is the first scene where he has to jump into the water to make a clean break from something pathological. So tyranny, you see this echoed, you see echoes of this in the story of Moses leading his people from Egypt, because Moses is a master of water, right? He hits a rock with a stick and water comes out of it, and he's floating on water when he's an infant, and he parts the Red Sea. And so he's a master of water and transformation, and the Pharaoh's kingdom is represented as desert stone, roughly speaking. And so the idea there is that, well, the kingdom is solid ground, but it can be a tyranny, and the water is chaos, but it can be the thing that you have to leap into to free yourself from the tyranny. It's not like in the Moses story that comes easy, right? Because the Hebrews leave Israel, or leave Egypt, which is a terrible tyranny. And you think, well, that's good, they've escaped from the tyranny. But that isn't what happens. They escape from the tyranny, they actually end up somewhere arguably worse, because they're wandering around in the desert for 40 years. And it's a brilliant element of that story, because it states clearly that when you go from a bad place to a better place, you go to a worse place first. And it's a great thing to know, because it also tells you why you might be unwilling to take the next step. You know, you're aiming up, but in order to aim up, you have to let go of something you already have. And then that'll put you into a state of chaos. And unless you're willing to undergo that intermediary state of chaos, and you might not recover from it, you're not going to get to the next level. So that's rough. Well, so Pinocchio, he decides that chaos is better than tyranny, and guided by his conscience, jumps into the water. And then we don't see anything happening in the water in this particular scene. They come back to shore, all half drowned and exhausted by their adventure, and they go back home. Carl Jung talked about this phenomenon. He described as retrogressive restoration of the persona. And so it's a complicated idea, but basically what it means is that sometimes you take a leap forward and you learn some things, but you can't catalyze a new identity, so you try to go back and hide in your old identity. And that actually doesn't work, because, well, things have changed and you've learned something, and that isn't who you are anymore. And so it's like you have to cut parts of yourself off in a destructive manner to fit back into the person that you were. Now what happens here is that Pinocchio escapes from this tyrannical situation and undergoes this descent into chaos, but he tries to go back home. He tries to go back to what he was, and he can't do that anymore. His father isn't at home anymore. And so when he goes home, he finds that there's no home there. Now, this happens to people sometimes, and it's often a shock to them. So one of the things I've noticed about Peter Pan type, I'm going to speak about men here because I've observed it more in men, is that they'll often stay under the thumb of their father. And you think, well, why would someone do that? Because it means they're subject to the tyrannical judgment of their father. They're always concerned about what their father would think, or whether their father approves of them, and so forth. And you think, well, that's got to be an unpleasant place to be. Why would you do that? One of the things that I've suggested to my clients and to other people sometimes is that here's a weird little exercise that you can undertake, a little thought experiment. So you have your parents, and of course your parents have friends who are about their age, and maybe some of them are people you only know peripherally. And I might ask you, well, do you care more about what your parents think than you care about what these peripheral people who know your parents think? And then the answer to that is, well, of course. And then the question that arises out of that is, why? I mean, for someone else, your parents are the peripheral people, and their parents are central. Like, why is it logical that your parents' opinion makes any more difference to you than the opinion of some randomly selected people who are approximately that age? Why is it the case that you would consider that they would know more than someone else? I mean, I know they know you better, and fair enough, but that's not the point. And then another point there is that to the degree that your parents' opinion about you matters more than some randomly selected people of approximately the same age, Jung would say, well, you haven't exactly separated out the God image from your parents, and so you're still under that combination. It's like, it's a complicated thing to talk about, but think about the Harry Potter series. Harry has two sets of parents, right? He's got the Dursley parents, and then he's got these like magical parents that sort of float behind, and he should know the difference between them. They shouldn't be one and the same. They're not for him. And it's like, well, you have your parents and you have nature and culture as parents, and you shouldn't be thinking that your parents are nature and culture as well. They shouldn't have final dominion over you. It means that you're not an individual yet, if that's the case. Freud said, for example, that no one could be a man unless his father had died. And Jung said, yes, but that death can take place symbolically. Okay, so there's that part of the idea. And then another part of the idea is, one of the times in your life when you actually realize that you're an individual is when you'll go and ask your parents something and you'll realize they actually don't know any more about what you should do than you do. And that sucks. And that's partly why people are often willing to maintain a tyrant-slave relationship with their father. It's like, on the one hand, you have to be inferior in a relationship like that. You know, you've always got the judge watching you. But on the other hand, there's always someone who knows what to do. There's always someone standing between you and the unknown that you can go ask, what should I do? Well, at some point you'll realize that the reason you can't ask that anymore is because they actually don't know any more than you do. And then that's a pain, like that is a symbolic death. And that's also when you establish a more individual relationship with your parents. It's at that point that you could conceivably start taking care of them instead of the reverse. And that's a time that should come. But you have to let that image of perfection go. And that exposes you. Well, that's what happens here. You know, Pinocchio goes home and he wants things to be the way they were, and he wants to stay under the careful care of the benevolent father, but that's no longer possible. He's past that point, and that's why the father has disappeared. And so Geppetto has gone off to look for Pinocchio because he also needs his son, but in any case the house is abandoned. And so then we see inside the house that everything's covered with cobwebs and everything's gone, and Pinocchio and the cricket sit on the steps and they're very concerned. First of all, they wonder where he went, so they're actually concerned that he's gone, but they also don't know what to do because there's just no going home. And so, you know, that's also the case that once you hit a certain point in your development, well, it's the same thing we already talked about. The answers that you're looking for are not going to be found in your parents' house. It's as simple as that. Now, you could artificially maintain your dependency, but, you know, if you do that for too long, things get pretty ugly. So you get pretty stale and you know, you're like bread that's been on the shelf for too long. So now they're wondering what to do and where he could be. And then there's something very strange happens. The star shows up again, and it turns into a dove, and the dove flies down and puts a piece of paper bathed in light with gold writing on it in front of the cricket and the puppet. So what in the world's going on there? Well, we know what the star is. We've seen it multiple times, right? It's also the place that the blue fairy came from. But it's this transcendent place. It's this place that occurs sort of as the ultimate ideal. And this time it delivers a message. So what's happening here is that Pinocchio is fundamentally oriented by the wish that his father made so long ago, right? And the wish was that he would become a fully functioning individual. And so that's that transcendent place. And Jung would say, when you orient your vision, different things appear to you in the world. So, and I mean this literally. So, because you can't see everything, your vision calculates what's necessary, your brain calculates what's necessary for you to see so that you get to the point that you're aiming at. And I don't mean that metaphorically, I mean it literally. Things that aren't relevant to what you're seeking, you won't see them unless they get in your way, and they have to really block your pathway before they'll be literally visible. So you orient yourself towards something, and that makes some things visible that wouldn't be visible, and makes other things invisible that you might have seen. And so when you change your orientation, what manifests itself in the world also changes. Now, Pinocchio is in despair here, and he asks himself, where could my father have gone? And so the question is, what exactly is he asking under those circumstances? And what he's asking is something like, I had a structure that was orienting me properly in relationship to the world. And as far as it was embodied in my actual father, it's now gone. Is there any possibility that I can find that again? And that is what you want. You see, like if you're in a chaotic circumstance, maybe you've escaped, let's say, from a bad relationship or something like that, and you're out of it, but now you don't know what to do. What you're hoping is that you can get your life back together, right? That you can put the pieces that have fallen apart back together. And so you're automatically going to generate a fantasy about producing another, let's call it stable state. You're going to be looking for the spirit that would enable that stable state to be generated. Because really what it is, in some sense, is your new personality. You're in chaos, you have to become something new in order to get out of chaos. And so you're hoping for that, you're hoping that you'll see it. And so that's going to make certain things visible to you. That's the proper way of thinking about it. You know, when you get curious about something, and maybe you're curious about something and you walk into a bookstore, that curiosity is going to guide you to a certain set of books. The fact that you have the question in mind is going to open your eyes to certain kinds of possibilities. And so if your goal is to reestablish your union with the positive father, let's say, then certain things are going to appear and other things aren't. And that's really what this represents. The transcendent star is the goal, which is this developmental process. It's capable of, let's say, delivering a message to you. In some sense, that's what's happening when you're thinking, you know, because you have a problem you want to solve, you have somewhere you want to go with your thoughts, and as a consequence of that, information reveals itself to you in the interior landscape. It's a very strange thing. You know, in some sense it feels as if you're producing the thoughts, but it could equally be said that you're watching the thoughts reveal themselves. And which of those is the more accurate description is by no means obvious. You can certainly have thoughts that surprise you, which is very strange. It's like, they're your thoughts. How in the world can they surprise you? But they do. So it's like you didn't know them before you thought them up. And then the question is, well, where did they come from if you didn't know them before you thought them up? Well, they sort of spring out of the void. That's one way of thinking about it. Anyways, this is a Holy Ghost symbol, this dove as well. So that puts some Christian imagery in here again. You could think of it as a manifestation of the spirit of transformation. That's another way of looking at it. Anyways, it's the conscience that interprets the letter. So it's sort of figuring out what the next thing should be. And weirdly enough, what the letter says is that Geppetto was out looking for Pinocchio and he got swallowed by a whale, which makes very little sense, to put it bluntly. Geppetto went to search for Pinocchio, and now he's at the bottom of the sea in a giant whale. And we leap right over that tremendous gap in logic and follow the story nonetheless. Okay, so what's the idea here? The idea is that if you fall into a chaotic state and everything falls apart, there's the possibility that things can come back together, including what you've just learned, in a new state. And so you can conceptualize that symbolically as the existence of the dead father at the bottom of of the chaotic landscape. That's the proper way, as far as I can tell, to think about it. It's like there's something down there that's capable of reforming and re-emerging, that incorporates the previous state, but that takes it farther. And you're not going to find that unless you descend into this chaotic place where it feels like all order is gone. While you generate order, it's going to be akin to the order that you had before, but there's going to be something new about it as well. So it's down to the bottom of the chaotic state to bring up what you're missing. And that's one level of analysis. Another level of analysis, you think, is, well, that's also what you're doing, that's what you should be doing in principle when you're going to university. You know, you come to university in roughly the same state as Pinocchio. You know, you're a bit of a puppet and you're kind of a jackass, and what the hell do you know? And it's chaotic because you haven't found your place in the world properly. And I don't mean merely for career, not that that's not relevant, because it is, but it's more important than that. It's because you're a historical creature, because you are a product of history. Unless you are enculturated properly, which means you understand your past, and in the sense that the humanities can allow for that, then you haven't been able to incorporate the wisdom of your ancestors into your day-to-day pursuits, and that's going to make you weak. That's the idea anyways. And so when you come to university, this is what university is for. It's so that you can go into the chaos and you can pull something out of it that's truly of value. And you can incorporate that in your own personality, and that makes you much, much stronger, like literally stronger, not more educated, but it's not like you know more facts. It's that you literally are a better person, and better means you can do far more things. You can articulate that's something that's of crucial importance, is that you can articulate yourself properly, which is more useful than anything else you could possibly manage. So now Pinocchio has to face the thing that he's afraid of most. And that's a complicated idea as well. So Jung had this phrase that he liked, that he took from the alchemists, which was in sterquilinus invenitur. And what it meant was, what you most want to find will be found where you least want to look. There's this old story that's from King Arthur, and King Arthur has these knights, right? They all sit around a round table, which means they're roughly equal. That's what the round table means. And they're off to find the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail is the most valuable object. That's what it means. So they're off to find the most valuable thing, but they don't know what it is, and they don't know where it is. But they know that there's a most valuable thing, so in some sense it's akin to them orienting themselves by the star. And they don't know where to look, and so what they decide is, they have the castle, and it's the middle of a forest, and so each knight decides to start looking for the Holy Grail by entering the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And so what's the idea there? Well, imagine there are things that come easy to you, and that you're fond of pursuing, and that you're happy about pursuing. So you've found those and pursued them, and you've mastered them. So you know all that, but then there's another place that you don't want to go. And so you haven't gone there, and you haven't mastered it, and you're very small in comparison to it because you haven't mastered it. And so it has this monstrous aspect. But it has, if what you're working, if what you're doing isn't working, it's where you haven't gone that you need to go. And so I can give you another example of this. So let's say you're an agreeable person. And so you don't like conflict, and you won't stand up for yourself, and you regard anger and the proclivity to provoke and to engage in conflict as something that's positively terrible. It's not only that you're not good at it, it's actually that it's wrong. So that's where you have to go if you're going to learn how to stand up for yourself. And that idea is echoed in the prominent stories of dragons and gold. It's exactly the same idea. Is that the dragon is this terrible thing. It's this terrible predatory thing that lives forever and is very, very wise. And it lives underground, and it'll kill you. It'll burn you up in a second. But it hoards gold. And so you have to go there into the dragon's lair if you're going to get the gold. And that's a representation of people's paradoxical relationship with reality. It's like you have to go out there and confront it in order to incorporate what it has to offer to you. But the probability that that's going to be intensely dangerous and push you right to the limit, first of all, those are actually the same thing. If it didn't push you to the limit, you wouldn't gain anything valuable from it. So you don't get one without the other. You don't get the gold without the dragon. That's a very strange, very, very strange idea. But it seems to be accurate. So all of that's lurking underneath this, in this imagery of the whale. The thing that's at the bottom of... Now, the whale, you can think of the story of Jonah. So that's echoed in this story as well. That if you don't follow the pathway that you're supposed to follow, that the seas will become stormy for you, and something will come up and pull you down, and you'll be in a terrible place for some length of time till you learn your lesson. And if you're lucky, you'll get spit back up on shore, and then you can go do what you should do. Well, I mean, that's not a lesson that anybody needs to have interpreted. I think everybody understands that. Anyways, the cricket tells Pinocchio what he has to do. And then something kind of paradoxical happens. Pinocchio decides he's going to go do this. And then the cricket has got this weird paradoxical response to that. On the one hand, he's sort of pulling Pinocchio back, saying, look, you know, this is foolhardy. You're going to go all the way down to the ocean. You're going to confront this terrible whale. This is really, really dangerous. But at the same time, when Pinocchio's on the edge of the cliff, the cricket helps him tie his tail around a rock, and he holds his finger in place so that Pinocchio can tie the knot. It's like the conscience is conflicted about this. It's really dangerous and foolhardy, but it's also necessary. And so he plays this dual role. But Pinocchio is leading at this point, so into the ocean he goes. I guess partly what this means is that if you're not oriented properly in the world, you should take your doubts and the chaos that you're enveloped in seriously. You should face it and think it through. You should go into it as far as you can go into it, because maybe you'll find something at the bottom of it. I mean, the alternative is to pretend that it doesn't exist. So then Pinocchio is at the bottom of the water. He can actually breathe down there, it turns out. So you could think that he's gone into the unknown. He's outside of dry land. He's in the unconscious. All of those things are true. And you might think, well, why would it be the world outside of what's known and the unconscious at the same time? This weird intermingling of those two things. And as far as I can tell, that's because when you're in chaos and you don't know what's going on, then you start imagining what might be going on. And that imagination is partly the world, as it might be, but it's also partly the structure of your unconscious mind, which is producing the fantasies. And so when you're truly in chaos, then the distinction between your fantasies and reality isn't clear. That's actually part of what constitutes the chaos. So imagine this. So you're in a relationship and the person betrays you. And you knew who they were, or at least you thought you did, before that moment. But now you're looking at them and you don't know who they are. And you don't know what the past was. And you don't know what the present is. And you don't know what the future is going to be. All of that's been thrown up into the air in a major way. That's traumatic. So much has fallen apart that it's traumatic. So what do you start to do? You start to imagine what might be the situation. Well, then the reality is your imagination and the reality at the same time. They're not pulled apart at all. You cannot distinguish between them. And so it was a Jungian idea. I could say that's the snitch that Harry Potter's chasing, by the way. I know that's a terrible leap, but that is what it is. It's that weird intermingling of potential and reality that can manifest itself as the world if you pursue it. It's roughly that. So Pinocchio is in this situation that's half fantasy and half reality, in this chaotic state. And he has to go down to find the thing that he least wants to find. And he's hoping that he's got this intuition that in facing that thing, that chaos, that life really is, that chaos, that he's going to find his father and reunite with him. So you could also say that in some sense it's a decision of faith, I suppose, because you might ask yourself, well, why bother confronting chaos? If chaos is the ultimate reality, then what the hell use is there in facing it? Because it's just going to reveal itself as the ultimate reality and drown you. But the myths always say the same thing. They say, no, if you confront what's really disturbing you, if you really confront it, you do it voluntarily, you're going to find order in it eventually. Or at least that's the only way you're going to find order. Okay, so anyways, Pinocchio's down at the bottom of the ocean, and every time he says, he's trying to find out where Monstro is. And they ask questions to the fish that are down there, but every time they mention Monstro's name, all the fish disappear. And it's like Voldemort, right? He's the guy whose name you cannot say. And Monstro is precisely that. It's the thing that frightens everyone. And so asking questions down there isn't helping very much. And so Pinocchio, what he does is he's calling for his father, and he keeps going deeper and deeper into the depths. And we're in a scene, there's a scene where the darkness of the ocean turns into an even more profound darkness, and that's what Pinocchio disappears into. And then we see Monstro. He's in this sort of foggy representation, this huge thing that lies very much at the bottom. And there's no life or anything around him except, I think these are mackerel, but maybe they're tuna. They're animated anyway, so it doesn't matter. But there's no life down there. He's so far down at the bottom of the ocean that there's nothing that's alive down there. So, and then we go inside the whale, which is of course absurd, and we see that the whale has eaten a boat at some point in the past. This is one whopping whale. And Geppetto is sitting with the kitten, of all things. He's also got that little goldfish bowl full of goldfish with him too, which is quite the feat. Anyways, he's sitting there, and he knows that he's trapped in the belly of the whale too, and that he can't get out. And so that's an interesting issue. It's because not only is Pinocchio lacking his father, which isn't a good thing, but the father is lacking the son. And there's some indication that the father can't get out of the whale without the son. And so it's like the possibility for order is down there in this chaotic state, but unless there's an active agent to go seek it out, it can't pull itself. It's not animated enough to get out by itself. You know, and you could say, well, there's wisdom in the libraries, but it's not going to, like, without you going in there and gathering it and embodying it, all it does is sit there in potential, in all of that implicit form. That's a good way of thinking about it. So anyways, Geppetto is feeling pretty hopeless because he can't figure out any way of getting out of the whale, and he's also starving. He's starving in the belly of the whale. And here's a way of thinking about that. Geppetto's a good guy, but he's old. And that means his way of doing things is no longer fruitful. That's why he's starving. And it's especially not fruitful because he's missing his son. He's missing the active element that the child represents, say the playful and transformative element that the child represents. And so if you get stuck doing something the same old way, at some point it's no longer going to work. Even if it was good at some point, it has to be updated. And it's updated by, let's call it the spirit of youth, or the spirit of attention, or the spirit of play, something like that. The willingness to break boundaries and take risks. And Geppetto is very, very skilled, but he doesn't have that, and that's symbolized by the loss of his son. That's why he was out looking for his son too. He needs him. And so they're in despair down there, trying to fish and not getting anything. And so Monstro wakes up. Mackerel happens to swim by, and Monstro wakes up. And so then he starts, I think they're tuna actually. They look like tuna to me. And so Monstro wakes up, and he opens his mouth, and a bunch of water starts to come in. And then you see Pinocchio with the fish. Now, there's very intense implicit Christian symbolism in this part of the film, and I'm going to lay it out point by point. So you may remember, and perhaps you don't know, that one of the symbols for Christ is a fish, ichthys, right? And that's a play on the Greek representation of Christ's name. But there's more to it than that, because all of Christ's followers are fishermen. And he performs a bunch of miracles with fish. And fish are strange things because, well, you can pull them up out of the depths. That's part of it. And so they're things that can be pulled out of the depth. And you could say that, it's going to be very difficult for me to take this apart, but you could say in some sense that Christ is a meta-fish. A fish is something that you can dine on, but a way of being is something that provides you with something to dine on a continual basis. And so you might say, well, is it better to have a fish or to be a fisherman? That's another way of thinking about it. And obviously it's better to be a fisherman because then you can get more fish. And so it's one thing to have something, but it's another thing completely to know how to generate good things. And so if you had any sense, you'd take the latter over the former, even though the former is more instantaneously gratifying and requires less work and responsibility. And so anyways, the whale opens his mouth and goes chasing these fish. And Pinocchio he's trying to get the hell out of there, even though he wants to find the whale. When he actually sees the whale, he leaves. And that's also a very common mythological, what would you call it? Plot element. It's very frequently that what happens when the hero first sees the terrible thing, the dragon say, the terrible thing that he's come to conquer, he like freezes and gets the hell out of there because it's far worse than he thought it was going to be. And so Pinocchio, it's like, no way, man, I'm not going near that whale. Away he swims. And in the meantime, Monstro has opened his mouth and the fish are pouring in, and Geppetto is fishing like mad, and he's catching fish like crazy. And so the little cat Geppetto is flinging the fish backwards into this like box, and the little cat is there whacking them to kill them while they're flopping around. And so they're pretty excited about this because they have a problem. The problem is how to get out of the whale. That's the actual problem. But a nested problem inside that is how not to starve to death. And so Geppetto's pretty happy that even though he's not getting out of the whale, that he gets to have something to eat. So you could say as well that he's not exactly focused on the right thing. He's focused on the micro problem instead of the macro problem. And that makes him kind of blind. So anyways, the whale swallows up Pinocchio, and Geppetto keeps fishing. And then he snags Pinocchio. Now this is cool because, and this is another example of that meta fish idea. It's like Geppetto's actually looking not for a fish, he's looking for a way out of the damn whale. And then he catches a bunch of fish and he's like focused on that like mad. And then he catches Pinocchio. And Pinocchio represents what would get him out of the whale, but he's so bloody obsessed with the fish that he doesn't even notice. So he catches Pinocchio and flings him into the fish basket. And so it signifies the blindness of Geppetto's orientation when he's inside the whale. And that's kind of a comment on his aged and insufficient nature. He's solving the problem very well, but it's the wrong problem. So anyways, he fires Pinocchio into the fish bin, and Pinocchio says, "Father, I'm here." And Geppetto says, "Don't bother me right now, Pinocchio. I'm busy fishing." So, well, then that's fine. So then he kind of wakes up. He has this little moment of insight, this little revelation that, well, he's caught Pinocchio, so who cares about the damn fish? So then he runs over to the fish box to grab Pinocchio, and instead he grabs a fish and gives it a kiss. And so that it's another way of hammering home the fact that there's this confusion that he's suffering from. He can't distinguish the local truth from the transcendent truth. And so anyways, he does figure it out. He tosses the fish aside and he grabs Pinocchio, and they're all thrilled to death to see each other, and so they're united. So Pinocchio has found his father, but they're still trapped in the belly of the whale. Now Pinocchio takes off his hat, he gets covered with a blanket, he takes off his hat, and he reveals his jackass ears. And so he's found his father, but he's damaged and not, Pinocchio, he's damaged and not in good shape. He isn't becoming what he was supposed to be. In fact, he's actually degenerated since Geppetto saw him last. And so he becomes embarrassed, and he says he has a tail. He says, "That's nothing, I have a tail too," and then he spins that around kind of laughing. Then he brays and gets really embarrassed, and so that's what you see here. He looks like, well, he's revealed himself as a jackass to his father. But you know, that's actually a good thing, because he is a jackass. And if he was unwilling to admit his insufficiency, he wouldn't have ever gone on this pursuit. So it's an admission of, it's a humility, and it's an admission of insufficiency. And you need that before you're going to learn anything, because before you learn anything, you have to admit that there are things that are important that you don't know, and that you're a fool, and maybe that you're a braying jackass. And so that's why there are injunctions in many religious writings that portray humility positively as the antidote to arrogance. That's the right way of thinking about it. Is that humility means I still have something to learn. I still have something to learn. I'm insufficient. I still have something to learn. It's exactly the opposite, say, of Lampwake's attitude. Anyways, Geppetto decides that a son puppet who's half jackass is better than no son at all, which is another indication of his relatively positive orientation towards the world, and they reunite. And then Pinocchio immediately sets his eyes on the main problem. It's like, hey, we're stuck in this whale. We need to get out of here. And it turns out that Geppetto's already built a raft, but there's a problem. And the problem is that, as Geppetto says, Pinocchio says, well, we'll wait for his mouth to open. And Geppetto says that doesn't work because when he opens his mouth, Monster opens his mouth, everything comes in and nothing goes out. So raft, fine, but there's no way of using it. And so Geppetto decides that they're not going to bother with that problem and they're going to go have some fish. But Pinocchio, his eye is still on the main prize. He thinks, no way, man, we're getting out of this whale. That's the fundamental thing. We're not going to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. We're going to attend to the fact that it's sinking. We're going to keep our eye on the primary problem. So he's a little more awake by now. So Pinocchio says, we'll make a fire. Now that's cool, I think, because he's down in chaos where his father is trapped, and the first thing he does is to use fire. And of course that's exactly what people do, right? Because we're fire users. And so this, and shaman, for example, are masters of fire. But there's this really primordial element to the story right here, and it's an indication that the thing that can transform order into chaos into productive order is also the same spirit that mastered fire. And so Pinocchio lays that out, and he says, we're going to build a fire. And Geppetto says, and we'll fill them up with smoke. And Geppetto says, great, smoked fish. So he's still stuck on this whole fish thing. And so Pinocchio runs around gathering up all the spare wood on the boat, including the furniture, which he starts to break. And Geppetto says, well, what are we going to sit on, while we eat our smoked fish? And Pinocchio basically says, politely, enough with the damn fish thing. I'm going to fill the whale with smoke, and that's going to make him sneeze, and then we can get the hell out of here. And Geppetto says, that's going to make him mad. It's not a good idea. And, well, I would say that that's the stance of the benevolent state against innovation. Even if the innovation is positive and even if it's transformative and freeing, the old state, even if it's good, is going to stand in opposition to that. And so that's also something that's very useful to know, because otherwise you can get bitter about that. Anyways, Pinocchio makes this big fire. Geppetto's pretty worried about it, and he starts to fill the whale up with smoke. And so this is where the whale turns into a fire-breathing dragon, which is quite cool. It's like in Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent turns into a fire-spewing dragon as well. And if you watch The Little Mermaid, that, what's her name, that Ursula, she turns into a gigantic snake-like creature as well, although she doesn't exactly spew fire. But the transformation of the ultimate monster into something like a dragon is very, very common, because it's the ultimate symbol of the unknown for a variety of reasons that we'll discuss later. So anyways, yes, it's a symbol of chaos. Anyways, and this is quite a horrifying scene. When my son he watched Pinocchio when he was about 4, and he watched this scene over and over and over and over. I don't know how many times he watched that movie, but it must have been 100 times. But he was really fascinated by this scene, and he was like locked onto it. It was frightening, but there was something in it that he was processing and cottoning onto. So anyways, you see the whale is starting to prepare to sneeze, and it's belching out huge quantities of smoke and fire. And Pinocchio and Geppetto and the cat and the goldfish bowl are all on the raft, trying desperately to get out of the whale, which inhales and pulls them back and then sneezes and pushes them forward. And at some point they actually break free. And there's a good gates of hell image there with the whale belching out smoke like mad and its jaws open. And so they're paddling madly away to get away from this whale. And the whale is very angry, just as Geppetto suggested. And there's interesting sound effects that go along with this. The whale actually turns into a... That's what happens when your phone is smarter than you are. the whale actually turns into something that's like a locomotive, and the sound effects become industrial. So it's this monstrous machine-like locomotive dragon that's bent on the destruction of Pinocchio. And you could say it's an amalgam of natural and social forces completely unleashed. Everything's unleashed against Pinocchio and his father. And so they're having a hell of a time. There's big waves, and they end up, the whale actually abandons them, but before it does that, it nails them with its tail and blows the raft into smithereens. And so then they're both in the water, and Geppetto and Pinocchio are drowning. And Geppetto actually goes down for the third time, so to speak. And as he's going down, he says to Pinocchio, "Save yourself, save yourself." And so that's kind of Pinocchio's last temptation, because Geppetto's had it, and he could just get to shore on his own, but he would have abandoned his father. And so that's the thing, and that's one of the issues that this movie grapples with, is what exactly is your responsibility? And you could say, well, it's to save yourself. But the myth that underlies this says, no, it's not. That's not exactly right. It's to rescue your father from the chaotic depths and integrate with that, and to save both. And that's your duty to your culture. But more than that, it's also your duty to your soul. It isn't going to work if you just save yourself, because you're still going to be a jackass puppet, even though you're going to be back on shore. So anyways, Pinocchio grabs Geppetto and carries him to shore, and the whale shows back up and gives him one more good wallop. And then we see everybody on shore, and it's peaceful again. And Geppetto is on his back on the dry land, and the kitten washes up, and the goldfish bowl washes up, and the cricket washes up. He's been outside the whale all of this time. And we see the cricket calling for Pinocchio, and then we see him lying in a pool of water dead. So he's died. Rescuing his father, he died. Well, why? Well, he is a jackass puppet, and maybe he was supposed to die if he rescued his father, because that insufficiency that characterized him is something that's destroyed by the process of encountering the chaos, which was so difficult it reforms the personality. And the same occurs when he rescues his father and incorporates that. So it's like, okay, so anyways, Pinocchio's dead. That's not good. So the next scene, we see them back at home, and he's lying dead on the bed, and Geppetto and everyone else are mourning his loss. And then then we see this magic transformation, and we hear the blue fairy's voice. And so it's like he's pushed himself to his limits, and a natural process kicks back in and revivifies him. But now he's no longer a jackass puppet. He's actually something that's real. And so then he wakes up and he notices that now, he's undergone this proper transformation. He notices his hands in particular. And then he tells Geppetto, who refuses to even notice. He says, no, Pinocchio, you're dead, lie down. So, Pinocchio convinces him that he's not dead. And then in celebration, they start the clocks again. And so time kicks back in at that point. And so then they have a big celebration. Music happens again, because this is a celebratory moment. And they dance, and the harmony is restored. The good old guy has his son, and so the house is properly set up, and the old state has its vision and its capacity for transformation, and the thing that transforms has the stability of the culture behind it, and so perfect. And then the cricket goes outside, and he's talking to the star and the blue fairy, and he says he's pretty happy about how this has gone. And so then she gives him this little medal, which is made out of gold, and it's a sun and it's a mandala all at the same time. And so it's made out of gold, and gold is a noble metal. It doesn't mate indiscriminately with other metals. It doesn't tarnish. And so it's a metal that represents the sun. And then he flashes his little badge at the star, establishing a relationship between his function as the proper conscience and his orientation towards the highest good. And that's it there. So he's got this little sun. He's wearing this little sun. So he's also transformed and developed as a consequence of this entire process. And now Pinocchio's conscience is properly oriented. It's oriented towards the highest value. And then the movie closes. And that's Pinocchio. So, I'll give you a minute and I'll take some questions and try to figure out how to shut my phone up. So does anybody have any questions? Yes?
You seem to have used a vaguely psychoanalytic approach to kind of extracting the inarticulated messages from the mythology and the stories and the religion that's developed over time. So could you almost say that those are kind of constructing this to a societal level out of an individual level? These are kind of the dreams of the collective unconscious?
Sure.
That's
exactly what they are. They're the fantasies of the collective unconscious. That's one way of looking at it. I mean, they also take a socially determined form, right? Because it's animated, and that's a technology, and it's obviously something that exists in a particular time and place. But yeah, it's a collective attempt to give voice to the oldest of behavioral patterns. So one time when I went to visit my nephew, he was running around in a night suit. He was only about 4 or 5. So he's acting out this mythological pattern, roughly speaking. And you'd say, well, how did he know how to do that? And the answer would be, well, it was represented all around him in the culture, in fragments. And like, kids are pretty good at putting fragments of stories together. That's really what understanding is to put fragments into story form. And so he'd watched Disney movies, and his parents had read him stories, and he did pretend play with the other kids, and all of those were like exemplars of this underlying narrative. They're variants of it, and because he can abstract and generalize, he's pulling out the central features of those narratives, the heroic features, and then embodying them. So you could say, well, the central features of these narratives are fragmented and distributed across the entire culture. And so they don't have to be exactly inside your head. They don't have to be part of your memory. They're distributed in the behavior and the actions and the stories of the entire culture. And you can put them together out of that. So, and people do that. That's why they're so hungry for stories like this one, or like Star Wars, or like Star Trek, or like the Marvel movies, or like Harry Potter.
Yeah, what you said about the last scene, your son watching it over and over again. My little brother did the same thing with the last scene of the first Harry Potter movie. The guy with the 2 faces.
Uh-huh.
He watched that probably 20 or 30 times.
Yeah, it's really interesting watching little kids interact with, because movies are unbelievably complex. I mean, by the time you're your age and you've seen, several hundred of them at minimum, the impact wears off. But it's really something sitting down with a 4-year-old who hasn't watched very many movies and walking through one with them. I mean, they're so turned on. It's just, I took my daughter when she was too young, actually. I took her to see The Mask, the Jim Carrey movie. Jesus, I mean, she survived it. I don't think I traumatized her. But she was sitting on my lap, and it was really like gripping a bundle of barbed wire. She was just like that the entire movie, and halfway through I thought, well, that's probably a little too much psychophysiological intensity for one small body, but those movies, they just have a massive impact on little kids, and they will do exactly that. They'll watch it over and over and over, and you think, what are they doing exactly? Well, they're trying to understand. They're gripped by it somehow, right? And it's like they're deeply curious. They know there's something in it, and they're trying to extract out what it is, and they'll repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. So they're hungry for the information because it's part of rescuing their father from the chaos. That's one way of thinking about it. So, other questions? Well, good enough then. Let's call it a day.